gavel.
Hello. The time is now 5:32 on April 24th, 2019, and this public meeting of the State Board of Education will come to order. The roll will now be called to determine the presence of a quorum. Mr. Hayworth, please call the roll.
Dr. Kostyo.
Present.
Mr. Jacobson. Mr. Jacobson. President Wattenberg.
Present.
Dr. O'Leary.
Present.
Mr. Parker. Mr. Parker. Dr. Sutter.
Present. Madam President, may I make a comment?
Yes, please.
Thank you. I want to thank all of the panelists who are here tonight and simply state that I have to leave for a flight that leaves DC at 8 o'clock. So if I miss your live testimony, I will be watching on Periscope from the airport. Thank you so much for being here.
Ms. Williams. Present. Mr. Batchelor. Mr. Batchelor. Ms. McClay.
Present.
Ms. Alicia. Ms. Alicia. Ms. Robinson. Ms. Robinson. Madam President, you have quorum.
Thank you. Members, we have a draft agenda before us. Are there any corrections or additions? Seeing no changes, I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Motion being properly moved and seconded, I will ask for the yeas and nays. All in favor say aye.
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 All opposed, nay. Motion is approved, and I will note for the record that Vice President Batchelor is here. Members, we have in front of us the minutes from our April 4th working session. Are there any corrections or additions to these minutes? Seeing no changes, I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Nay. The motion being properly moved and seconded. Okay, it passes. The motion is approved. All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ruth Wattenberg, Ward 3 representative and president of the State Board of Education. On behalf of the members of the DC State Board of Ed, I want to welcome our guests and our viewing public to our Wednesday, April 24th public meeting. The State Board normally holds its regularly scheduled meetings on the third Wednesday of every month at the Old Council Chambers at 441 4th Street Northwest. This month, we shifted our meeting to accommodate DCPS's spring break. In addition to broadcasting this meeting live via the District Knowledge Network, we are also live streaming via Periscope on Twitter, and the video for the meeting will be posted on our YouTube page, DC SBOE. Tonight, we will consider a ceremonial resolution recognizing Financial Literacy Month. Financial literacy is important to successfully navigating adulthood by establishing and maintaining healthy financial habits. I want to thank Representative McClay for bringing the resolution forward. We'll hear that in a moment. I also want to take a moment to thank the members of our staff who have been working energetically to promote the application for our school year 2019-2020 Student Representative and Student Advisory Committee. They have done a terrific job. The application period remains open until the end of the month, and I urge all interested high schoolers to submit an application. Your voice is important, and we want to hear from you. Tonight, the State Board will hear testimony from 6 experts on the subject of measuring high school growth and quality, including several who are especially familiar with DC schools and policies. We are hearing from these experts because later this spring, the board will be receiving a proposal from the Office of the State Superintendent of Education about if, how, and when OSSE believes the current system through which we rate our high schools should be modified to reflect the learning that takes place in our high schools, known as growth. More on these issues later. The superintendent's not here?
On our way.
Okay, at this point we are going to move straight to our ceremonial resolution, correct? Okay, so we're going to consider the ceremonial resolution. We use these resolutions to recognize and honor people, schools, or items of note. This resolution honors National Financial Literacy Month. I will turn to our at-large member, Ashley McClay, to make the motion.
I move to recognize Financial Literacy Month, National Financial Literacy Month in the District of Columbia and with the State Board of Education.
Do I hear a second? The motion having been properly moved and seconded, Mr. Hayworth, will you read the resolution into the record?
State Board of Education ceremonial resolution recognizing National Financial Literacy Month, CR 19-9. Whereas the U.S. Senate first designated April Financial Literacy for Youth Month in 2003. Whereas the following year, the Senate designated April as National Financial Literacy Month. Whereas the goal of National Financial Literacy Month is to raise awareness of personal finance issues and help individuals and families develop healthy financial habits. Whereas the District of Columbia Department of Insurance, Securities, and Banking offers free educational programs on preventing financial fraud, planning for retirement, developing a plan for saving, and understanding insurance. Whereas National Financial Literacy Month is an opportunity for educators to focus on developing financial literacy and understanding in students before they enter the full-time workforce. And whereas organizations such as Jumpstart and the Council of Economic Education support educators and families in achieving the goals of National Financial Literacy Month by outlining steps, sharing materials, and offering guidelines for education and dissemination of information. Now therefore be it resolved that the D.C. State Board of Education celebrates the importance of National Financial Literacy Month, and be it further resolved that the State Board recognizes the importance for students in the District of Columbia and their families to understand and manage personal finances.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on the resolution?
I would like to.
Representative McClay?
I want to say thank you very much for the board recognizing National Financial Literacy Month in the District of Columbia and with our students across the DC public school system. I want to recognize this month because it's whether a student is in second grade and learning how to write a check for the first time, or a senior in high school filling out their FAFSA. We all know that financial literacy helps to guide students into college, career, and throughout their life. The impact financial literacy can have, or the lack of financial literacy can have on one person's life, can be very significant, and it is something that our high school graduation task force looked at when looking to change our high school financial, or looking to change our high school graduation requirements. We see the benefit of financial literacy throughout our education, and I'm proud to recognize this month.
Any further comment? Mr. Batchelor?
I'll just thank my colleague, Ms. McClay, for introducing this important resolution and giving us all time to reflect on providing all of our students the opportunity to learn how to manage finances and to learn how to be economically successful. What we know is that in a lot of our communities, while we have economic inequality, some of the inequality lies in the knowledge, the background knowledge that our students get to be prepared for life and to be financially successful. And I think it's important that we all advocate that our students, even without getting that background knowledge at home or in the community, have access to knowledge like this in the classroom, so that they can not only be academically astute, but also be productive members of our society, but also productive and reliable members of their families and of their households. So thank you, Ms. McClay, for the introduction.
Any others? Before moving on, I'll just say quickly, I was a guest at Critical Exposure last year where I talked with a group of students who were involved in activism and becoming journalists, and financial literacy was their top priority from the year. So it is a big deal for our students. The State Board welcomes public participation in seeing no further Seeing no further discussion, the vote is now on the approval of ceremonial resolution 19-9.
So moved.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? The ayes have it. It's passed. Okay. Moving on, the State Board welcomes public participation in activities under our authority. At every public meeting, we begin with...
Sorry, do you want to stop and have the superintendent speak first?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Superintendent Kang, we did say that you were going to come, and you would be recognized as soon as we finish financial literacy, so please...
Thank you very much, President Wattenberg, and I apologize for being a few minutes late. So I appreciate the chance to offer public comments and the opportunity to be here as always. I wanted to just start off by noting that I know we all believe that every student can make academic progress and that the hard work of our school leaders and teachers every day to support our students in making that progress should be acknowledged and rewarded. Through the STAR framework, we've been able to clearly identify schools that are making exceptional progress with students and learn from their practices. Our recent All-Star Schools tour highlighted schools like Amadon Bowen Elementary School, which showed strong growth for all students in math and exceptional growth for students with disabilities and students who are at risk. When we visited Amadon Bowen, we saw teachers working hard to improve their instructional practice by collaborating to analyze student work and observe each other in rehearsing lessons. Schools like Center City Public Charter School, Brightwood, had the highest middle school framework in DC, including exceptional growth for their English language learners. And there we saw students engaged in elective programs like music, technology, and dance. We also saw that the school had created a positive culture around making mistakes, which encouraged students to take risks and ask questions when they do not fully understand. These practices are making a positive difference for their students. We're all excited to be able to identify these proof points for our high schools as well. As we developed our SS State Plan and the STAR framework, stakeholders, including LEA leaders, school leaders, and teachers, as well as parents and family members, expressed the importance of incorporating student growth into the STAR framework as much as possible. Currently, in all frameworks, including those for elementary, middle school, and high school, we include growth in English language proficiency and improvement in student attendance. The STAR framework for elementary and middle schools also includes specific growth measures around reading and math, including growth to proficiency and median growth percentile. We would like to take steps to do the same for the high school framework. As you know, when the State Board of Education approved the STAR framework and our SS State Plan, I expressed my commitment to developing high school growth measures for future inclusion into the accountability system. I promised to present to this body a plan to include high school growth in the STAR framework at the conclusion of the 2018-19 school year, and we will be following through on that commitment by presenting that proposal to the board in June. In the meantime, I'm pleased to see that the board is proactively preparing for our discussion on that proposal by inviting thought partners to discuss incorporating measures for high school growth into the STAR framework, and I'm excited to listen to the board's conversation with the panel this evening. I should also note that the schools that I mentioned and 8 other schools that we visited across the city were written up in our recent All-Star Schools Tour report, which is available on our website at osce.dc.gov, and we've brought copies for all of the different members of the State Board of Education this evening, and we will share those with you all this evening. In other news, I wanted to highlight a couple of efforts that OSCE is undertaking that align with the board's policy interests. Specifically, we know that the transition from middle school to high school is a critical one, and it is important that students are well supported to make that transition as seamlessly as possible. Since 2015, Raise DC, in partnership with OSCE and other school partners, has formed the 9th Grade Counts Network to strengthen student transitions from 8th to 9th grade. The network empowers schools with the right information to better meet the needs of rising 9th graders and equips students with the academic and non-academic skills they need to succeed in high school. Raise DC also launched Kid Talks in 2017, which is an additional service that facilitates conversations between middle schools and high schools to review student data and support planning around specific student needs for rising 9th graders. The Bridge to High School Data Exchange saw participation from 95% of the eligible middle and high school campuses, representing over 5,000 enrolling 9th graders, and we hope to have even greater participation for this upcoming school year. Schools have until April 26th to sign up for these programs, and more information can be found on OSCE's website and on OSCE's Twitter accounts. We hope that you all will encourage the middle and high schools in your ward to participate to the extent you're in contact with them. In addition, we know that the board has also expressed interest in school climate surveys, and we were pleased to discuss the use of those surveys and our ongoing efforts with the ESSA task force earlier this month. As a reminder, OSCE will host its first school climate conference on Friday, May 10th, 2019. The conference will convene educators and stakeholders for skill building workshops, networking opportunities, and best practices happening around the city. I'm particularly excited about the youth panel that we'll be featuring at the conference. The conference will be held from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. at Gallaudet University's Kellogg Conference Center, and we hope that you all will stop by for some or all of the event. Thanks for the opportunity to speak this evening.
Thank you very much, Superintendent. The State Board welcomes public participation in activities under our authority. At every public meeting, we begin with testimony from public witnesses on education-related matters. Your comments will become part of our official record. If you are a member of the public and would like to speak at a future public meeting, please contact our staff by email at sboe@dc.gov or by calling 202-741-0888. Tonight we have 5 public witnesses. If witnesses have provided written comments for the record, those are available on our website. We will have 1 panel of witnesses tonight. As I call your name, please come down to the table. Our panel will be Laura Fuchs, Co-Chair for the Washington Teachers Union, Cathy Reilly, Executive Director of SHAPPE, Scott Goldstein, Executive Director of Empower Ed, and I want to acknowledge that Vice President Marcus Batchel and I are both on the advisory board of Empower Ed. Tiffany Pyen, a teacher at Ballou High School, and Beth Carmichael, teacher from Powell Elementary School.
So I mentioned Tiffany is on her way in right now.
Okay, great. All right, you each have 3 minutes to speak this evening. Please note that you must use your microphone. Your mic is on, and it helps to move the mic so that it is about 6 inches from your mouth. The light on the table will be green for the first 2.5 minutes. It will turn yellow for the last 30 seconds, and it will turn red after 3 minutes have elapsed. We will begin on your left, my right. Please begin when you are ready.
Good evening. My name is Laura Fuchs, and for the past 12 years I've taught at H.D. Woodson High School. For 9 of the 12 years I've taught at H.D. Woodson, we have faced significant cuts to our school's funding. Tomorrow, April 25th, teachers, parents, students, community members, and allies will be rallying at Freedom Plaza at 4 p.m. to fund our students' future. Too many schools are being forced to make significant cuts, and today Chancellor Farabee testified in front of the council defending those cuts since stabilization funds had not yielded results, his words. What is enraging is that DCPS has been cutting back on funds for years, not investing. And so, in fact, his logic is flawed. It is cuts that have not yielded results, not investments. What DCPS has been investing in is central office programs, what Farabee relayed as strategic investments today, that they've been doing for 10 plus years. So according to Farabee's logic, it is central office's investments that have not been yielding results and should therefore be cut. We need your presence at the rally tomorrow at Freedom Plaza at 4 p.m. to fund our schools. Our neighborhood public schools are in serious jeopardy. And today, Chancellor Farabee proved that his office does not only not know where the money is going, they have no intention of getting answers to real questions. They want to follow the old handbook where you come and take your licks at a hearing, then go about your business and do whatever you want with the funds. We know this at our school for a fact because DCPS asked principals to submit lists of names of employees who will lose their jobs while we were on our spring break. Aside from the fact that this circumvents the Personnel Committee's role in this process, since many members were on vacations and not available to meet and give recommendations, it circumvents the council, who have not finalized the budget and are likely going to give DCPS additional funds beyond what the mayor requested. If we had an empowered school board, this kind of nonsense would result in the selection of a new superintendent. Under mayoral control, the mayor views this as a consolidation of power. The selection of yet another chancellor demonstrates to me that the person is not the problem. Rhee, Henderson, Davis, Wilson, Alexander, and Farabee, they have all been frustratingly the same at council budget hearings. They aren't transparent or inclusive in decision-making because they don't have to be. Today's fight is to make sure that funds reach our schools. Tomorrow's fight is to figure out a method to force our schools to be more transparent. Be it through the school report card or ending mayoral control, we need your voice in this fight. Go out to your schools, bring back their stories, find ways to use your position as a bully pulpit to get the changes that we deserve for our students.
Thank you. Ms. Reilly.
Thank you. My name is Cathy Reilly, and I am the Executive Director of the Senior High Alliance of Parents, Principals, and Educators, and a convener of the Ward for Education Alliance. I appreciate that the board has invited Jack Schneider and others to look at options for a high school growth metric to be used in our current system. It's my hope that this is the start of a revamping of the way we look at and evaluate our schools. In fact, the test scores still play way too large a part. Their role in the STAR accountability system will continue to drive how time is spent and priorities set in the school day. When the current STAR system was approved by OSSE and the State Board of Education, all acknowledged that it was only a first step and there would be changes. Some of the other changes that were strongly recommended are a look at school climate, and I appreciate that Superintendent Hang mentioned that Kang are gonna pursue that. Beyond suspensions and attendance data, there are surveys that tell us more about how parents and students experience a school. And secondly, metrics that would incentivize a full and broad education, including social studies, art, music, and science, and foreign language. Currently, the focus is necessarily on English and mathematics and the performance on tests. That's what we see, that's what's measured, that is what is prioritized. Instead of report cards, the district could term them school profiles and seek to make the document more of a description rather than a report card that put schools in different buckets, either success or fail, when we don't really have the metrics to determine that, and we're not looking at a broad enough picture. There were suggestions in both of these areas that can be pursued. The star rating is on a bell curve. There will always be 1-star failing schools by the way we're looking at it now, regardless of how much achievement, progress, or growth there is. We have a system that now really rewards schools who attract highly achieving students, and it punishes schools working with students who arrive with challenges or perhaps talents that we aren't capturing on our standardized tests. What we have now does more than it shames. I mean, I'm glad that you visited successful schools, but a lot of schools who were labeled as 1-star, and the children in those schools don't feel successful, and many of them are successful. Many of them are learning and achieving quite a bit. So I hope you will continue to work with Dr. Schneider and others on the model, especially Dr. Schneider, on the model they've worked on in Massachusetts that includes more nuance and a broader look at education and at the work we want our schools to do. This look at growth can't be the end. I hope it's the beginning. Thank you.
Mr. Goldstein.
Good evening. My name is Scott Goldstein, founder and executive director of the DC Teacher Advocacy Organization, Empower Ed. Today I'm here to talk about the star rating system and why it's one of the biggest emergencies in our education system today. Since the ratings were released, I've been hearing an overwhelming demand from teachers to elevate this issue and how it's hurting their schools. Put simply, the star rating is exacerbating inequities in our city. Hardworking teachers, principals, and most importantly, our students across the city were hit by what felt like a ton of bricks by a corrosive label applied to their school this year, feeling a deep gulf between the label applied and what they know to be true of the school and of themselves. By using narrow, incomplete metrics to define schools, we get inaccurate results. We know the metrics are almost universally tied to poverty at present. The star rating tells us much more about who the school serves than how they serve them. As I recently read a book called Ghosts in the Schoolyard, Racism and School Closings on Chicago's South Side by Eve Ewing, I realized how problematic these metrics can be in answering the question, whose reality counts? Is it the reality of those who see indisputable numbers on a page? Or are schools what they are seen by the communities they serve that depend on them, centers of family, community support that these measures don't account for, and for whom these measures are deeply biased? Furthermore, parents with the assistance of the rating system are using the ratings to self-segregate. A recent article on the pro-education reform site 74 Million reported referencing a Duke University study. In fact, a new study finds the increasing ubiquity of school quality ratings may be changing the complexion of whole neighborhoods and cities, deepening the divide between rich and poor areas. The reason? Information on school performance becomes widely available. The wealthy and well-educated flock to the areas with the highest school ratings. Meanwhile, families and schools with fewer resources are left in their wake. These rating systems don't empower families as much as they drive them apart and make it that much harder to close persistent achievement and opportunity gaps. Among people who study school ratings, there's simply no debate that summative school ratings exacerbate inequities. You'll hear that clearly tonight from one of the best people you could hear from in Jack Schneider. The only disagreement is truly among those for whom diversity and equity are secondary to individual choice. That's a dangerous disposition. While OSSI has argued that they were forced by the ESSA law to comply with a state report card, there was no requirement in that act to give a top-line summative score to schools. I'll skip over the next part. You have my testimony and all of the supporting material. But the state board can act and must act fast because the current trajectory is disempowering students, teachers, principals, and the community members that are working hardest to close our persisting gaps and, in fact, exacerbating inequalities in our city. So I urge you to do two things. Advise OSSI to add quality indicators to the report card, curricular strength and variety, family-school relationships, portfolio assessments, student, parent, and staff satisfaction, teacher turnover and teaching environment, and mental health, social-emotional support. But I also urge you not to view your important educational role in leadership in isolation. Housing and education and equity work hand in hand. If we don't remove the summative score, despite the data and research, we're complicit in making both of those worse in our city. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My name is Tiffany Pyen. I am a teacher also with Empower Ed's Teacher Council. I'm a teacher at Ballou High School, and we received 1 star from the new DCPS star rating. I was very disappointed when I looked into the technical guide on metrics because it was unclear how exactly the raw scores were calculated. So I saw that there were measurements in decimals, and then there's a star rating. And as a teacher, this was a little confusing for me to follow, but I think that there must be some sort of distinction between the at-risk students and the students that come from really low socioeconomic statuses, especially in a school like Ballou where the majority, if not all of the students come from poverty. Comparing that school with a school maybe downtown Northwest, it seemed like a subjective process. So last year, our principal was fired abruptly, and we now have a new principal, and there's a high teacher turnover at Ballou, and none of these things are accounted for when someone, like a parent, is deciding whether to send a child to a charter school or a DCPS school. Although we do have a high level of absenteeism, that is not indicative of our students' potentials to succeed. And what occurred at Ballou is the result of external decisions to hire or fire people, and also and none of that data or anecdotal data is reflected in a star rating. So Southeast is known for its high rates of crime, and it's not fair that students in these schools with low star ratings will now suffer further losses both in how they are perceived in their neighborhoods and from parents of neighboring schools. I think that the low ratings will perpetuate negative stereotypes without clear explanations or details, which goes against a more nuanced approach that we try to teach our students when we instill critical thinking skills. Therefore, I would like to recommend that demographic and socioeconomic data is controlled for better in these metrics, and that you can have more like variables, comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges, and perhaps I recommend outsourcing the whole evaluation system to a third party that's not within the school system. That way, as a parent or a family who's trying to make a decision about where to send a child to school, negative perceptions of students coming from impoverished neighborhoods won't be perpetuated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Carmichael.
Hello, my name is Beth Carmichael, and I'm a kindergarten teacher at Powell Elementary School. I'm also a member of the Empower Ed Teacher Council. I'm happy to be here today to advocate on behalf of DC teachers and families as well. I understand the value in a school rating system. Parents have a right to see a snapshot of the school that they will put their child in for years' worth of their lives. Of course, the largest issue with any rating system, particularly the star rating system in DC, is that families are given a number to rank schools from, like I heard earlier. Families can only see a tiny snapshot that is given to them, a very limited overview of what each school looks like and has to offer. And then the number overshadows that snapshot. When talking with families from my school, I constantly hear what is important to them, none of which include a number that represents our school. They look for quality, happy teachers, rigorous curriculum, and opportunities for their children's social-emotional skills. As currently designed, the star rating system recognizes the importance of a school environment, but fails to consider the factors that truly lead to a positive school environment. Chronic absenteeism, attendance, and re-enrollment barely scratch the surface of what a school environment looks like. What about teacher absenteeism and attendance, teacher re-enrollment or retention? What about teacher-child interactions and relationships in grades that are above pre-K? Parents want to send their children to schools where teachers want to come to work, want to return year after year, and want to build long-lasting relationships with the families who will spend so much time with them. As currently designed, the STAR school rating system highlights the value of academic growth and achievement, but fails to value the hard academic work that teachers, families, and children are doing in their daily school lives. Are standardized tests really the only metric of academic achievement? What about all of the projects that students work on collaboratively in the classroom? What about the units that teachers adapt and modify to meet the multitude of needs of their diverse student populations? What about portfolio projects that families come and participate in, watching in real time the learnings of their children? We know that a variety of measures and assessments exist, and the STAR system doesn't begin to value the academic achievement our schools are really demonstrating. Families choosing schools deserve to know what really happens in the daily academic lives of their children, not simply a mandated statewide test. Instead, let's add some of the important work being done in our school's overall snapshot. Let's consider including a measure of pre- and post-assessments aligned to curriculum that teachers are using daily with children in schools. And let's consider, too, the projects happening throughout the city, like DCPS's Cornerstone projects. These types of projects offer insight to the achievement of big learnings and collaborative efforts being made by our students. I also have another piece that you can look at further in the record. But I want to urge you to two things. Expand the vision of the school environment to include other measures that families want to know about, teacher retention, interactions with students, and also expand the snapshot of what academic growth and achievement looks like for families. Include projects and curriculum-based assessments that connect to real daily student learning.
Thank you very much. Are there questions from members? Ms. Gassoy?
Thank you very much. I share your concerns about the STAR rating, but one thing that we hear a lot is that, we want a measure or a tool that will be easy for families to, navigate and to make decisions based on that. And so, what I hear some of you saying is that we should have something that removes the stars, and I'm just wondering what your idea is for making that something that will be, easily navigated, that will be something that families, that's user-friendly, basically.
If I can answer that. So, yeah, this is a common, I appreciate the question. This is a common concern that parents want something and deserve something that has all the data in one place and that's user-friendly. Absolutely. They deserve the access to all the data we're reporting and much more data than we're currently reporting. The summative score is where we're taking issue. And the concern is that you can't have it look nice, be pretty, be user-friendly, and be simplistic enough for parents to look at and understand. It's absolutely inaccurate, right? There are places that do this, that it's actually beautiful to look at, much in the way that when I did standards-based grading with my own kids, you had red, yellow, green, right, on a bar for each of those skills. What we're talking about, if there's 30 measures that we're looking at instead of the current more limited scope of measures, they might break down into 4 or 5 categories. So you'd have 4 category bars or circles, right? Each one of those might be red to green. And they would include 4 or 5 measures within each category. But all you're looking at as a parent is 5 or 6 categories, whether they be student climate, mental health supports, work with students who are chronically absent, and those would be green to red or some variation of that, and then they could dig into the data further. But it gives a much more complete picture that's not hard to look at.
I think that part of the fallacy is, a 4-star or a 1-star school might be a better match for your child. So part of what we're kind of telling parents is this doesn't actually tell you what's best for your child. A 5-star school may not be the best match for your child. So we want actually people to look at, visit a school. We want to encourage. It's not a simple thing. Choosing a school for your child, you should look at what's safe, what's close. But I think it's a mistake to say we want something simple for parents to look at. We actually want to say, this is a job that you have to kind of put some time into for your child. Your child isn't every child.
Mr. O'Leary?
The STAR rating really scared me when I found out about it when I was still teaching, because I knew that immediately that Cardozo was going to get 1 star. And Cardozo was going to get 1 star because of the test scores. Period. End of sentence. And that's what happened. And it wasn't just Cardozo. You knew that H.D. Woodson was going to get 1 star. And you knew what schools, okay, good. And you knew that what schools were going to get 5 stars. And there were some surprises both ways. Probably not as many with 1 star as there were with higher star ratings, all right? But it's not an accurate description of what goes on day by day in a school. And it's going to punish those schools in August, because there are going to be people that won't send their children to schools that have 1 rating regardless of anything.
Just to chime in really quick, sorry, Fraser. It's punishing schools right now. Farabee testified today on this return of investment thing. He said it so many times I lost count because I started to see red. He is already making statements about funding, saying that the funding going into DCPS schools that are still not doing well after 5 years of stabilization funds is a lack of return on investment. It was a clear connection to test scores. It was a clear connection to the star rating. And frankly, it's a signal to me that those schools are up for something drastic, be it a charter takeover or closure. I mean, I don't want to be, Chicken Little, but honestly, it was really disturbing what he said today, and it's tied to star ratings, test scores, and the funding cuts are happening now.
And the problem is that is the reality, and that the schools don't have a chance to rebound because they're getting less money than the schools that have the higher star ratings. And it's going in the completely wrong direction.
Mr. Parker.
Thank you all for being here. Ms. Reilly, I really appreciated your comments in particular around the star rating not telling a full enough picture for all of our students. I totally agree that for some of our schools, a given star may not necessarily communicate the ways in which that child, whether it's by race or special needs, might be met in the classroom at that school. So I do think that that's very important. Also, I'm getting to my question, but I also share in the concern slightly different. My issue is less with some of the calculations, as you all mentioned, but more so the follow-up. As a system, what are we doing? And this gets to Ms. Fuchs's comments, what are we doing for our 1 and 2 star schools besides punishing them? And I think that's yet to be seen. But I did have a question for, I believe it was Tiffany, that you mentioned about using more portfolios in the calculation of star ratings or in our star ratings. And so the question is, are there any proof points where that has been standardized and or used in a system similar that we have here in DC, in a similar fashion that you're mentioning?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the technical term for portfolios. What did you mean exactly?
Oh, sorry, it was Beth. Yeah.
Okay, Beth, sorry.
Well, DCPS currently has something that they call Cornerstones. That is a project across the district. So with that would come different rubrics and things that are aligned to the curriculums that are already being done in different grades. So something similar to that, I think, is a great place to start as far as alignment and being able to compare and also showcase what is actually happening in the classroom.
There's definitely value, I would argue, to teachers being able to showcase and students being able to showcase their work. 2 thoughts come to mind. How then do you accommodate for charters that don't have that same cornerstone program, but also how do you standardize that evaluation across the city? How do you ensure that in my classroom, my portfolio is not rated more conservatively than in your classroom, and therefore we're attributing that value to students?
I think that's a large question, right? I think that that's definitely a concern to think about. I think that there are ways to work with charter schools in designing something that looks very similar to what Cornerstone's is. It might not be an exact replica of what Cornerstone currently is, but using that as a basis to jump from, I think, is a realistic option.
Awesome. And with my last 18 seconds, I would just mention, I know there's a lot of conversation around standardized tests, but I will remind folk that the tests are based on the standards that this board voted for and approved. And so it is a measurement in part, not in full context, of how students are performing on those standards. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Batchelor.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you all for joining us. Ms. Fuchs, I do look forward to joining you and other members of our community tomorrow to advocate for the adequate funding our schools need. Obviously, nothing that we approve from this dais makes a difference if folks in our school buildings don't have the resources to teach it with fidelity. And so I appreciate your advocacy and look forward to joining you tomorrow. Obviously, it goes without saying that my ward is bearing the huge brunt of inequality in funding, and there are many young people, 16,000 students in my ward, who are counting on your advocacy to get them the resources that they need. Ms. Reilly, thank you for joining us and for being a strong partner of the board. Obviously, the growth metric is something that we've been talking about, especially at the high school level, since ESSA came before the board almost 2 years ago, and we've stayed persistent, and we're appreciative that OSSI has invested the time to present some options to us, and we look forward to that conversation in the next couple months, and obviously advocating fiercely for its inclusion as early as possible. Mr. Goldstein, thank you also for your partnership. Obviously, there was robust conversation around the star rating itself and about what it should measure from this dais, or at least a previous iteration of it. But I do want to underscore that previous iteration, this body did pass that star rating, and so the onus is on us to advocate fiercely. Well, first to listen to our communities, and then advocate fiercely for the corrections that need to be made to make sure that it measures the true quality of what's happening inside our school buildings. And obviously, I don't have to tell many of you, and especially not Tiffany from Ballou, about the impact, the unintended consequences that happen from something like this. And though they may be unintended, they're consequences nonetheless. And while causation and correlation are relative, a 32% decline in enrollment at Ballou and a 23% decline in enrollment at Anacostia is not just happening by happenstance. And so we need to be honest about those unintended consequences and adjust accordingly to make sure that our neighborhood schools aren't being adversely impacted. So I just wanted to say that and thank you all, and thank you as well for your advocacy around this issue. And with my last 10 seconds, I'll just say that you have the dedication of the members of this body to make sure that we get it right. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take the last question, and I am going to ask a question to Ms. Carmichael. So quality comes in different forms, but for schools, I do think the key part is learning, and that's why I'm very much in favor of a growth measure. But I also acknowledge that it's very difficult technically to figure out how you do that for high school. So I was very interested that you raised the idea of the pre and post assessment scores based on the testing that you have. And I wonder if you could just describe it, because I'd like for our experts who are going to come up on a panel to sort of have a vision in their head of what does exist and the extent to which that is something that could be turned into something technically useful and reliable.
Mm-hmm. Well, as probably many of you know, throughout DCPS there are a variety of curriculums. So if we expand that to charter schools as well, there's lots of different curriculums happening in our schools. One example that I think is pretty aligned across DCPS is in math classrooms, particularly in the elementary school level, is a curriculum called Eureka Math. They provide assessments that are already done with rubrics that are then used across the district. And those include assessments that you can use at the beginning of the year, you can use them at the middle of the year, and at the end of the year. You can also use them at the end of each module of the curriculum throughout the year. I think it is a great way that currently DCPS teachers are already coming together and talking about where students are and what they need to improve upon. But I think it's a great way that our standards aligned, that are a way that we can see where students, when they're coming in at the beginning of the year, where are they at the end of the year, and where do teachers in the upcoming year need to focus their efforts on and making sure that students are growing from where they are coming in at.
So these are assessments that teachers now use at the beginning and at the end of the year, very directly aligned to the curriculum. Now you know what those assessments are at the outset, or not necessarily, you teachers?
As if you are familiar with the curriculum, those are things that you can pull from and use, yeah.
Okay. No. Sorry, guys. We have oh, you want to use my 30 seconds? You can have 15, and Fraser can have 15.
Can I have 15 too?
Yeah, 5 seconds. There's a difference between formative and growth assessments. I believe the Eureka assessments you're discussing are formative in nature, in the sense that it would be impossible to track growth over the year, in part because they're related to different standards on different assessments. So I just
we will take that up.
Draw that point of distinction.
And I'd just like to reinforce the importance for everyone here and anyone listening of our rally tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock at Freedom Plaza for full funding for DCPS. It's imperative that you get the word out so that Freedom Plaza stops traffic.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, panel. Thank you, members. And the next panel can come up, right? No. Oh, no, okay. No. Oh, they can come up, right? But, okay, just. Okay. The DC State Board has approval authority over our statewide accountability plan. When the board approved the current accountability plan, as Superintendent said, it was done so with an agreement between OSSE and the State Board that we would revisit how we rate high schools by the end of this school year. This revisitation was needed because of a specific recognized limitation in the high school rating system. In our elementary and middle schools, the school rating includes what's known as growth. That is, part of the rating is a measurement of whether and how much students in a given school have gained in their reading and math scores from one year to the next. This is meant to reflect in the school rating a real-time index of whether and how much students learn in a given school, arguably a school's paramount goal. But there were technical reasons that OSSE was unable to include such a measure. Among them, unlike grades K to 8, where students take PARCC tests each year, in high school, students only take PARCC tests once, at some point between grades 9 and 12, depending on when they take specific English and math courses. So with just a single test, how do you measure growth? Can you compare the high school score to the 8th grade score? And what about the fact that 8th graders are typically taking algebra and the high school test is on geometry? Could you measure the growth instead between student scores on their PSAT and their SAT? The issues are complicated both substantively, what kind of measure is meaningful, and technical. How do you make comparisons when students are in different schools and the coursework in the two grades is different? Perhaps there's an alternative approach that allows us to measure quality without getting into this technical thicket. Any school rating is going to be incomplete. Any rating will be a simplified, limited view of a school's quality. But how simplified and how limited is too simplified and limited? And what are the alternatives? As anyone who follows DC school issues know, it's a huge issue. Tonight's discussion is designed to assist the State Board and the public to better understand the relevant issues prior to receiving OSSE's proposal for addressing high school growth in the STAR rating framework. Tonight's guests are all experts in different aspects of measuring school quality, with members of the second panel also having a special familiarity and experience with DC's rating system. As I call your name, please come down to the table. Our first panel will be, and this time really you can come, Taryn Hochleitner, Senior Associate with the Data Quality Campaign, Stephen Kostyo, Policy Advisor with the Learning Policy Institute, and Jack Schneider, Assistant Professor, College of Education, UMass-Lowell. Taryn Hochleitner is a Senior Associate on the Policy and Advocacy team at Data Quality Campaign, where she focuses on how policy can create the conditions that allow teachers to use data to better serve student learning and to empower families, and how to simultaneously make effective data-driven decisions and safeguard student information. Stephen Kostyo is a Policy Advisor at the Learning Policy Institute, working on LPI's deeper learning and policy teams. His work focuses on equitable resources and access, closing the opportunity gap, and ESSA. Jack Schneider is an assistant professor in the College of Education at University of Massachusetts Lowell and the Director of Research for the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment. His work focuses on history, culture, and rhetoric in education policy. Welcome to you all. You each will have 5 minutes for testimony, and then we will do 2 rounds of questions from members, and we will begin on your left, my right.
Good evening. My name is Taryn Hochleitner. I'm a Senior Associate at the Data Quality Campaign. At DQC, we work with education leaders to ensure the effective use of data in education. I appreciate the opportunity to share considerations for how leaders in the District of Columbia can ensure that everyone with a stake in education can use growth data to take action that improves student outcomes. I'm not a measurement expert, but I spent months working with colleagues and experts to write a brief explaining the ways states are measuring growth in their accountability systems. The landscape is complicated, and there's a need for more public conversations about these measures. We applaud the State Board for prioritizing these issues. When reported side by side with proficiency data, growth data provides leaders with a richer understanding of student performance in schools. We're encouraged that the district has joined 48 other states in including individual student growth as a school accountability indicator. This is a meaningful step towards creating a more complete picture of school quality and an important use of the district's investments in the longitudinal data system. But if this data is going to be used to shine a light on best practice, inform public understanding of school quality, and guide how resources are deployed to support schools, everyone, from parents to policymakers, needs to be able to understand and use this data to take action. There are different ways to measure growth, which uncover different insights about student performance. The most common growth measures used for accountability take one of 2 approaches, each with its own advantages and limitations. One group of measures evaluate student progress alone, revealing how well students are mastering grade-level learning goals over time. Gain score measures generally track improvement in a student's test score year to year. Value table measures create performance levels above and below proficiency and reward schools when students move between levels. Growth of proficiency measures evaluate how students are progressing towards proficiency and whether they are on track to achieve that goal in a given time frame. These measures are fairly easy to understand, and they offer more information than a moment-in-time test score does. But just like proficiency data, they are subject to state-determined benchmarks, and they can be correlated with income or demographics. So none of these tell education leaders how adults in a school contribute to student achievement. Student growth percentile and value-added measures take a different approach. They compare a student's performance to that of their peers or what's expected. This helps leaders draw conclusions about whether the adults in a school are helping students learn, regardless of proficiency status. SGP measures rank how students are performing compared to their academic peers. Value-added measures demonstrate the impact of adults in a school on student achievement. These measures can take student characteristics like demographics into account. They are the best measure we have available to inform equity conversations. SGP and value-added measures do not reveal how well students are mastering standards, which is why it's important to view them alongside proficiency rates. When median growth percentile was first included as a school accountability measure as part of the district's No Child Left Behind Act waiver, it changed the way leaders, parents, and community members understood school quality. This new measure allowed leaders to identify schools where adults were helping students learn no matter where they started. In addition to MGP, the district has included a growth of proficiency measure in the current accountability system. This offers information about which share of students are on track for proficiency within 5 years. No matter which measures are used, to ensure that growth data informs decision-making across the district, we recommend focusing on 3 areas. First, consider whether measures align with the district's equity goals. Accountability measures reflect values. These are the needles that you're asking schools to move. Our current growth measures answering critical questions like how well are schools serving students of all backgrounds. Second, remember people will not use data they don't understand. These measures are not intuitive or familiar. Leaders in the district must clearly explain how to interpret growth data on school report cards and communicate what story it is telling about student progress and school quality. Third, ensure those closest to students have secure access to the growth data they need to inform practice. Take stock of how growth data is informing continuous improvement across the district. Do adults in schools have the information they need to take action and support all students on their path to success? The State Board of Education has taken an important step by starting this public conversation. Focusing on these areas will ensure that together families, educators, and policymakers can put data to work for students. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kostyo.
Great. Good evening, and thank you to the DC State Board of Education for having me. My name is Stephen Kostyo, and I'm a policy advisor with the Learning Policy Institute. We are a research and policy organization that is nonpartisan and nonprofit, and part of our goal is to bridge the research and policy gap in ways that advance equitable learning opportunities for every child. I appreciate the opportunity to share information about the benefits of focusing on performance and growth in state accountability systems with you today. Measuring, reporting, and using growth and performance on individual indicators in accountability and improvement systems is particularly useful for tracking gains and changes in equity gaps. Growth can describe whether the selected supports and interventions are working and where progress is being made. For example, focusing primarily on a percent proficient measure fails to make distinctions among students or schools who are farther away from or closer to cut points, and those who have made significant progress or have largely stagnated in their progress. Further measures that rely solely on moving students across a threshold, for example, from basic to proficient, create the incentive to over-direct attention to what have come to be called the bubble kids, students near the cut point at the expense of others. Research demonstrates that due to the strong negative relationship between achievement and poverty at the school level, focusing primarily on achievement to evaluate school performance biases evaluation systems against schools that serve large percentages of students from poverty and reward schools with wealthier populations. Status measures do not show what the school has contributed to student learning. Therefore, growth measures should be a significant factor in evaluating schools. This graph shows student achievement in low poverty schools compared to high poverty schools from a state we are currently working with to inform its accountability and improvement systems. As you can see, high poverty schools have fewer students performing at proficiency than low poverty schools. However, this only tells part of the story about what's actually happening in these schools. This slide looks at student growth towards proficiency. And as you can see, there can be growth in both high poverty and low poverty schools. This graph shows how examining growth data provides a very different picture of whether learning and gains are occurring at a school. Growth data can show that contrary to the picture painted using achievement data alone, which low and which high poverty schools are making significant contributions to student learning. I'll conclude with 5 considerations on the benefits of focusing on performance and growth. First, both growth and proficiency are important indicators of student and school progress. Second, growth across all levels of performance should be incentivized and acknowledged in accountability and improvement systems. For example, moving from the 4th quartile to the 3rd, or moving from the 2nd quartile to the 3rd. Third, distinctions should be made between schools that are, first, performing well on an indicator and showing growth, performing well on an indicator and not showing growth, not performing well but showing growth, and finally, not performing well and not showing any growth. These distinctions should inform how resources and supports are prioritized and targeted. Schools that are not making progress in growth or proficiency should be prioritized to inform decisions about resource distribution and to more equitably serve all students. Finally, growth and performance should be measured and used across all indicators in an accountability and improvement system. Information on growth across indicators provides a more accurate assessment of which schools are making progress towards meeting student needs. For example, DC is measuring both the number and the growth in the number of students attending school 90% or more of the school year. This type of information across indicators provides a more accurate assessment of which schools are meeting student needs. As DC moves forward in its efforts to include a measure of growth for high schools, DC can also partner with one of the 20 states that are including measures of growth in their accountability and improvement systems at the high school level. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Dr. Schneider.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Jack Schneider. I'm an assistant professor of education at UMass-Lowell and director of research for the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment, which makes for a very unwieldy acronym. So I think I will actually come in substantially under the 5-minute mark because I will not repeat much of what has already been said about how growth scores work and why they are better than achievement scores. I'll fill in a couple of gaps and then I'll talk a little bit about what else should be done in terms of measuring school quality. So a couple points worth making about the correlations between status scores and demographic variables. We've talked about poverty. It's also important to talk about race, and it's important to talk about parental educational attainment. There are obviously correlations among those variables, but when we are talking about achievement scores, right, status scores, we are in many cases talking about demographic variables that are in disguise, and that is far more troubling than talking about demographic variables directly. When we talk about race and class and privilege, and we do so under the guise of talking about school quality, it allows more privileged members of our society to separate themselves without having to be outward and upfront about what their separation actually means. They can do so under the guise of seeking better schools for their children, and it is very critical for the purpose of creating integrated schools in an integrated society to accurately measure school quality in a way that allows people to make better choices for a democratic society. That's just one point that I think is important to add when we're talking about growth versus status. Another is about the way that growth scores can stave off some of the reputational damage to schools that serve our most vulnerable students, right? Right now, we don't create very many opportunities for those schools to be celebrated for much of the incredible work that they're doing, and growth scores constitute a really critical opportunity to celebrate the, in some cases, really tremendous work that those schools are doing, despite often facing more difficult work. A couple points about how growth scores are not a panacea, which is something that the other two panelists have already mentioned. One, I just want to echo, even though it's already been said, and that's that growth scores are difficult to understand. And a second, which has not been mentioned, is that growth scores still represent whatever the technology of a standardized test is able to measure, which is not a tremendous amount, right? It's an important tool, but it is a very limited tool. And so if the only tool in our arsenal is a standardized test, it doesn't matter how we slice it and dice it, ultimately we're going to incentivize gaming, and we're going to narrow the curriculum, we're going to narrow the mission of schools. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the other things that should be considered when we're talking about rating schools and trying to measure school quality. It is critical to expand the measures of school quality so that any system reflects and encourages the full mission of public education, right? Not just so that schools don't end up gaming narrow systems and narrowing their focus in the process, but also so that we, as stakeholders, all of us, are focused on the many things that schools should be doing. We also should be focused on answering the questions that families actually have about schools, right? Yes, people do appreciate simple star rating systems, particularly when they're trying to do something like pick a place to get a sandwich. But as somebody in the last panel mentioned, people are willing to do a little bit more work when they're talking about the education of their children. So particularly when we're talking about the things that parents care about, there is lots of polling data that shows parents care about things like school safety, school culture, the degree to which kids are known in school and cared for by their teachers, the degree to which they trust their peers, the degree to which young people are learning to be citizens. All right, these are all things that can be measured. I said I was going to come in under time. I'm not, but I will finish in 30 seconds. Another point here is that we need to give parents and community members data that enable them to get active and involved in schools and to support schools and advocate for change. An overall rating system doesn't do that. And a summative rating system, no matter how high quality the component parts are, ultimately sends a misleading message about schools, that they are uniformly good or bad, right? That we buy them or we leave, and that's not how schools work. Schools are ecosystems.
Thank you. Okay, members, we will have, first, thanks for excellent testimony. Members, we will have 2 rounds of questions with each member with 3 minutes per round. Now, I want to say, all of us, myself included, have a tendency to ask longer questions. And so what I'm going to suggest is that we're really going to cut it off at 3 minutes. And the reason you know that's true is because John Paul is going to do it. I don't have the guts to do it. John Paul is going to do it. So try to keep, we have 2 rounds. We also have 2 panels, so we have a long time. So try to keep your questions concise, and panelists, try to keep your answers understanding that we want to get through a bunch of questions. All right. Who would like to go first?
Actually, we have we typically do in attendance order. So I will call names for individuals. Dr. Kostyo.
Thank you. Thank you all for the testimony. It's very helpful. Dr. Schneider, I understand that you have helped to develop and are using a very different tool in Somerville, where I used to live, by the way. And I'm just interested to know a couple of things, actually. First of all, I understand that it doesn't rate schools, that it's actually more of a school profile. Is that correct? And so I guess I'm just curious if a growth measure is part of any aspect of it, and then also if I assume high schools are included, and so how the high school assessment looks different, or how we might learn from what you're doing.
Yep. So I'll try to be brief. So we have a consortium that presently has 7 district members, including Boston, and we are growing, so we will have 8 soon and 9 shortly after that. Currently, we serve 1 out of every 10 students in the state of Massachusetts. In terms of measuring student academic achievement, that is one of 5 major categories. Somebody on the last panel talked about the ability to present, I believe that he said, a profile rather than a scorecard. That's the approach that we take. The 5 major categories on our profile are teachers and leadership, school culture, resources, indicators of academic learning, and community and well-being. Under indicators of academic learning, we use Massachusetts's SGP score, which is the student growth percentile. It's available both for elementary schools and for high schools. And then we also have been working to build a performance assessment system, which is not entirely unlike what was referred to earlier as a portfolio system. I can talk about that later if folks are interested. One of the questions that was asked was about how do you ensure essentially a level of inter-rater reliability, and you can do that through training teachers and raters, right? This is something that happens every year with the advanced placement program. People go through a training, they are tested with regard to their inter-rater reliability, and then there's periodic recertification. So the last piece is to talk about how all of this is presented, and as again somebody mentioned on the previous panel, we do not present things in quartiles or quintiles. We don't present things in terms of stars. We show where people are on a performance spectrum that we seek to create as a criterion referenced performance spectrum rather than a norm referenced one.
The representative's time has expired. Dr. O'Leary.
Thank you very much. You mentioned reputational damage as something that we are faced with schools that have a 1-star rating. And our neighborhood schools, we're lucky in the district that we have, we'll have in August, all the high schools will be, have been renovated, brand new schools. The buildings are not the problem anymore. Now the problem is, how do we get students to come to the school? And I'd like for all three of you to talk about how do we get those 1-star schools to get above 1 star without having to completely destroy the way that they're rated, but also with changing maybe the numbers on how important one test is.
I remember as a former teacher the importance of testing week and some of the pressures around that. But I think the growth conversation across indicators can start conversations about where schools are performing well and where they can improve. So one of the considerations that I mentioned was really focusing on those schools that aren't growing and that also are low in proficiency. But there are also a lot of schools that are growing but are just low in proficiency. And partnering those schools with the schools that might not be growing as much, you can have information sharing between faculty and other school leaders to talk about some practices that those other schools could adopt to help them move forward.
I think something that's also often missing from these conversations is the communications piece. So in addition to the accountability decisions that are made to determine, what are the important indicators that we're measuring that schools should perform on, it's also a matter of how do we communicate then what story is being told by the data. So what does a 1-star mean? How can community members and parents understand that and also understand maybe what steps are being taken to make improvements. So I think there's also a lot of room to add context and a so what to the data that's on a report card.
I think there's a lot of potential here in terms of revamping data systems to tell a different story to people who do not currently send their children to schools, because the people who already have their children in schools already know what the quality of those schools are, and in many cases have pretty high opinions of those schools, not uniformly, but research demonstrates, polling demonstrates that they have higher opinions of schools than people who are not in those schools. And we've done an experiment. I'm trying to talk as fast as I can as I watch this clock. We've done an experiment where we've found that people's ratings of schools that they don't know change dramatically depending on the data system they're exposed to.
Representative's time has
On a
expired.
game show.
Ms. McClay.
Yes, hi. A question for the panel. You all have mentioned your reservations with the current star rating system. And Mr. Schneider, you mentioned you like the profile model that you guys are looking into. Are there any current states that you have seen where you would suggest we look into their rating system and or that are doing a good job in measuring student growth?
Okay, so one would be the core districts in California, which acquired a waiver back under NCLB, which was of questionable authority for the department to grant, but nevertheless got one, and they operate their own school rating system, which is a fairly unique one that draws on multiple measures, including student and teacher perception surveys. There is a pilot project that is happening in Texas. I can't remember the name of it, but I bet somebody with a phone could look it up. And Colorado just, I believe last week, passed a law that would create the opportunity for districts in the state to develop their own innovative models, which they are seeking to model in some cases on the work that we're doing in Massachusetts through our consortium.
And just to build on the core district model, they also wrote a memo to the California State Board of Education that looked at different growth models to look at how they would identify different schools, and I think they've put a thoughtful thought process behind how to provide that information at the state level.
I think this is an area that we hope to dig into more, is how states are actually putting these growth measures to work and making decisions based on them, but we don't have as much information now.
Thank you very much.
Representative Williams.
I'm sorry. Is there a way to consider state standards while moving toward a more holistic approach to measuring school quality?
I'll kick this one off. Absolutely. One of the things that we talk about with teachers, because in many cases teachers actually do appreciate the standards. They think in many cases, not in all cases, that the standards represent a kind of high quality interpretation of what students should be able to know and do by the time they reach certain grade levels. They have a problem with their hands being tied with regard to what that looks like in terms of instruction and what that looks like in terms of the operations of a school. So in terms of portfolio assessment, as it was referred to earlier, or performance-based assessment, you can absolutely tie that to state standards, and that it shouldn't be done unless you have a set of standards that you're going to be able to use. And in terms of more holistically measuring school quality, taking a fuller picture of what a school community is and does not preclude us from saying that there are also a set of academic standards that we believe all schools should be holding kids to. So I don't think that those are in any way mutually exclusive from each other.
Thank
you. Excuse me. Mr. Batchelor.
Thank you. So my question is, it's this board's priority to make sure that as quickly as possible we include a growth metric at the high school level, or at least to explore that fact. My question is, other than the standardized test we currently use, which is the PARCC exam, are there any promising trends around the country of other assessments that could be used to measure growth? I know that at least for some grade levels at the high school level, we have near universal taking of the PSAT and the SAT. Are you seeing kind of that being a promising way to assess growth at that grade band?
I would just respond and say that if I were to choose between the SAT and the PARCC, I would probably choose the PARCC, but that is not an endorsement of the PARCC or any other existing standardized test, but the PARCC is at least more aligned with the curriculum being taught in schools. So I would have a hard time, speaking to the previous question, supporting a standardized test that was not aligned with the standards that the state, or in this case the district, had already bought into. There are ways to engage in standardized testing that do not lead to as many of the unintended consequences as we tend to see. And so one of those is by measuring more, which reduces the relative weight that standardized tests carry. So it's harder to game something when there are multiple measures that matter. Another way to do it is by not testing every single student every single year. That, of course, applies more to grades 3 through 8 than to high school. But by doing grade span testing, you can then reduce the unintended consequence of, relentless test prep and teaching to the test, which we see right now.
Dr. Sutter, by proxy.
Hi, yes, I'm asking a question for Dr. I'm asking a question for Dr. Sutter, who is at the airport. DC only tests once in high school. Are there ways for us to measure growth? What might we think about in deciding how to do so? And I'm going to just start on the right.
I'm not an expert on assessments or how to measure high school growth, so I think that would just be an important determination to think about. Is that a measure that's going to answer your questions, and are those an assessment that's also going to be useful for educators and those closest to students?
One of the considerations I gave is that growth can be measured across indicators, so it doesn't just have to be for test scores, that you can look at, as DC is doing, at indicators such as chronic absenteeism, or if you have other indicators tied to accountability, you can report not just on that particular measure, but also the growth in that measure, and that can give a fuller picture of student performance across schools.
24 other states do it. And they're not testing every single year in high school. So I think that's pretty powerful evidence that it is possible. To give you the case of Massachusetts, in Massachusetts, the MCAS is given at grade 10, and so it is possible to use a student's prior testing history. Granted, it will be more complicated, and I don't think anybody wants to talk through all of the psychometric challenges here right now, but it will be more complicated if there are multiple tests being given in multiple years at the high school level. But as long as students are in DCPS and maintain the same student ID number, you have their prior testing history. Particularly if they're taking PARCC, you're able to pull from a larger pool, a larger capital N, in terms of comparing your small n, right, the sample of students that you have test scores for, comparing them and benchmarking them against the growth that would be expected from demographically similar students or students with similar prior testing histories.
I'm going to ask a follow-up on behalf of Dr. Sutter, and if you're watching, tell me if I did okay. But could you, so what you're saying is that in Massachusetts, that's in fact what happens, is that their students are tested at 8th grade and then not again until 10th grade, and that is regarded as good enough. Am I understanding that correctly?
So I actually won't speak for exactly how SGP is calculated in Massachusetts because it is a fairly opaque process. But I can tell you that standardized testing happens in grades 3 through 8 and then in grade 10. And so I think we can make some inferences then about how SGP is calculated.
Representative Parker.
Thank you all for being here. In particular, I acknowledge the value of growth, and I know we're wrestling with how does this work at the high school level. At the same time, I'm often, a point of tension for me is, are we merely trying to use growth as a proxy to lower the bar for our students, right? And so when I hear conversations, it's not about just making a 1-star school 5-star so we can say, oh, it's a 5-star school or it's a great school. For me, it's about how do we make sure students are meeting the bar of what we've set, which are our learning standards and measurements against that. And so I guess the question, and any of you can take this, is like, how do you marry a focus on absolute proficiency and growth in our current state? It seems to me there would need to be a shock in the system or some greater mechanisms or levers in the system to ensure that students, by the time they're getting to 9th grade, they're not they're not severely behind or are incapable of reading on grade level. It seems unfair, but at the same time, we don't want to just pass students along. So how do you marry those two? And then Mr. Schneider, you mentioned parent perception of school quality. Would you also acknowledge that parents' perception of school quality may not necessarily always be in line with actual student performance at said school? And so I just wanted to make sure I was clearly understanding your point around like parents sending their kids to a school and their understanding of quality. So
I think in terms of marrying the two, that with proficiency alone, you don't understand the trajectory of where a student is moving. So, when you're thinking about resource allocations and if a student needs more or a school needs more intervention, it's likely if they're not growing and also if they're not proficient, that those should be the people in your classroom, the schools you should be focusing on. So I think that's what growth adds to the conversation.
I'll give you a very specific example, and I won't name the school. There's a high school in DC that is a one-star school. Student proficiency is in the single digits. Growth annually is high. In other words, teachers are growing students in large numbers. At the same time, many of students are not graduating proficient by the standards that we've set at the high school level. So how do you accommodate or wrestle for that? Or is it merely enough that we then say that's a 5-star school or that's a 3-star school instead of it being a 1-star?
I think that's part of a broader conversation. That's really, I think, unless you see that data and sort of how different measures would identify different schools, it's kind of difficult to make that determination.
May I ask for a 20-second extension on this?
You can have 20 seconds from my time.
So just a quick point would be that you don't need to have a star rating system, right? And so I think that's a false choice there. And then additionally, I would say that you don't lower the bar because you continue to collect the data and post it and act on it, particularly internally. You just don't pretend that you're measuring school quality when you are looking at status scores, because you're not.
Thank you. The representative's time has expired. Mr. Jacobson?
Thank you, and thank you all for spending your time with us this evening. I really appreciate it. Dr. Schneider, I believe in my research there are only 16 states that have a high school growth metric, but I don't want to spend my time arguing that point. What I'd like to get into with you is you gave us some very interesting alternatives beyond a school rating system. Are those alternatives ESSA compliant?
Yes.
Okay. The other question I have is, can you measure growth with a single assessment? Can a single student or a single cohort take a single test a single time and be able to measure growth?
No.
No. So how do we measure high school growth without adding additional assessments? Because I've heard a lot from constituents and a lot of board members, current and former, have talked about over-testing. So could someone speak to that a little bit, please? I think, Dr. Schneider, you had some interesting alternatives that you said were kind of in the weeds, but we've got a minute and 40 seconds.
Sure, and I'm sure my colleagues at the table have things to say as well. The point that I made earlier, I think, is the clearest point that can be made about this, which is that if students have been in DCPS, you have their prior testing history, and therefore when they sit for an exam in high school, they are not sitting for a single exam in their careers. They have already sat for exams in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. And if you have a small number of students who just enter the system in high school, which tends actually to be the reverse of the case, we tend to see students leave the system in high school rather than enter the system in high school. But in the case of transient students who enter the system in high school, if it's a small enough number, then you can actually just use the scores of all of the other students. You'll have a large enough N size there for those students pulling from their prior testing histories in DCPS.
That's very intriguing, and I'd like to explore that, but DC is a highly transient student population, both between sectors, between DCPS and our public charter schools, and with Maryland, with our neighbors in Maryland and Virginia. I don't know that a system like this would not necessarily work for the unique characteristics that our students are in.
Well, let's sit down and look at the data.
Thank you. Yield back.
President Wattenberg.
Thank you. Thanks also, this has been terrific. So the purpose of the rating, this is partly in response to Zachary and to focus this, the purpose of the rating, as I think about it, it is to acknowledge the quality of the school. It's not our way of judging whether an individual student has reached a certain level, because we can look at their score and know that. So the rating really is about the school quality. So my question to each of you is, for those of you who know, and I don't know how knowable it is, if we give a single test at 10th grade and don't factor in the earlier grades, to what extent does that 10th grade score reflect the quality of the school? Or to what extent does the portion of kids in a given school who reach proficiency reflect the quality of that school?
This would just be a single
right, I'm
data
saying,
point.
that's right. So currently what we do is there's a PARCC test at 10th grade. And we also, by the way, we use SAT scores, we use some AP scores. So it's not just the PARCC, but it's mainly the PARCC. And there's no growth portion to it. So how much does that tell us about the quality of that school?
I think showing the two slides that I showed shows that it's really hard to just look at schools with that measure alone. That adding growth can really tell you, is the school adding to a student's learning or not? And that provides a much broader picture than just the status alone, which is highly correlated with the economic status of the school. So I think that you would have a much broader conversation by having both.
Mr. Schneider?
Let me suggest that this is another false choice, and that it is possible to test students in 10th grade and figure out where those students are and use that information in ways that are not harmful. Using that information the way that it was used back in the 80s when I sat for standardized tests, for the purpose of planning, for the purpose of making internal decisions, right? Holding schools accountable for things beyond their control isn't really an effective practice, right? That's well established by research literature, and nor is it an effective practice to make that data available to parents and purport that it tells them something about school quality. So it's possible to continue to test students and to then try to measure school quality more fairly and more comprehensively and use those data points to inform the public and to inform district decision making.
And it sounds like you're saying not just more comprehensively, but also more accurately.
Yeah.
Representative's time has expired. Round two, Dr. Kostyo.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask I think a simple question and then a more complicated one. So this is for Dr. Schneider again, is I'm just curious who carries out or how the assessments are carried out with your model, but also just full disclosure, I was a founding teacher at the Mission Hill School in Boston, and that was part of the pilot school, is part of the pilot school network, which used for a while the SQR, the School Quality Review, which is a really different kind of assessment. And one way that it's really different is that it really engages everyone in the school in the assessment of their school, and it therefore cultivates shared responsibility. And it kind of brings up this idea of, or the issue that was raised before of like, what's the objective of the assessment? So one is to, of course, assess the quality of the school, but I would, having experienced this really rich assessment that actually helped me to be a better educator and to improve my school, that's possible, that should also, it should and can be an objective. So I'm just curious also, to hear more about the Somerville model and if that's part of it.
Yeah, I think your point is a really important one, and that is that we focus so much on a kind of market model for data, right? That people are going to go around shopping for schools with this information, and we neglect the democratic practices that can be really fostered through information and data. So helping teachers see the things that they're unable to see from their own classrooms, connecting teachers and giving them data to have evidence evidence-based conversations about what's going on in their schools. And the same for community members. I'm less interested in helping parents shop for schools than I am in empowering parents to have conversations about what's going on in their schools so they can get more active and more involved in them. In terms of the data we collect a lot of additional administrative data, many of which were mentioned by somebody on the previous panel. We also administer student and teacher perception surveys, very extensive surveys, which we can talk about later if you want. And we then also pull from existing state data systems. And then, one more point is just about all that can be done in addition to this, right? So a school inspectorate model exists in many nations around the world where there are trained people who can walk through schools and spend time in schools to actually see with their eyes rather than trying to use a quantitative bureaucratic tool for seeing. So there are lots of options out there.
Representative's time has expired. Dr. O'Leary.
I have a couple of questions about what happens to the juniors and seniors in the high school since the 10th graders are tested and since the schools are rated on the PARCC test for the 10th graders and the 10th grade teachers are spending their whole year professionally trying to get kids ready for a test. And I was teaching seniors. And the growth rates, the reading rates and the writing rates of the seniors improved dramatically, but it's not part of the assessment. And it's not part of a growth mechanism that lets you know what the whole school looks like. And I think the problem we have with the star rating system is it doesn't tell you what the whole school looks like. And how can we change that?
I'll just say, as you all are focused on high school accountability and thinking about high school growth, you can also think about what other questions do you have about high school quality that might be different from elementary and middle school, right? So are there things that you want to know about high schools, questions that parents might have that may not be answered by a growth measure but could be an additional indicator? I'm not an accountability expert, but I would encourage you all to start with your questions, and if there are things that you want to know, it's a good place to focus on.
I think you get at a good point of these growth measures can also be used to have conversations outside of accountability between principals and teachers or teachers and students to inform broader conversations about their own trajectory and how that plays a role in meeting their own goals.
And I would just once more mention the power of tools like performance assessments, which particularly given these other uses of assessment, right, for conducting conversations internally within a school, or even doing so in an outward-facing way by using the assessments that teachers give in their classrooms, teacher-created classroom-embedded performance assessments, which by definition are not distracting from the work of teaching because they reflect the actual work of teaching. And so investing in the kind of training required to build a system like that is a significant investment. That said, professional development funds are by and large, not in every case, a kind of boondoggle nationwide where we spend billions of dollars on professional development and have a lot of questions about what we're getting as a result, right? So channeling some of those funds to exactly the kind of project that it seems like you're interested in seems to me a pretty smart investment.
Thank you. Representative McClay.
No further questions at this time.
Thank you. Representative Williams.
No further questions.
Thank you. Dr. Sutter by proxy.
This is a question for Taryn. What did the data quality campaign find in looking at the high school growth metrics in the other states?
So what we did was we looked at states' ESSA plans and what they had committed to including in their accountability systems. So we really just took account of which states had committed to measuring high school growth. And we actually found there were 20 states, so somewhere in between the numbers that had been mentioned. Of course, this is what it was committed in the ESSA plans, which might change in implementation. We would like to do that in the future, take stock of what states are currently doing. And we also found that states were using high school growth across the type of measure that they were using. So it didn't matter if they were using student growth percentile or value added or gain score. There were states that were using high school growth measures in all of those categories.
Thank you.
Additional questions?
No.
Thank you. Representative Parker.
Thank you. Mr. Schneider, you two just referenced like teacher portfolios or assessments, not portfolios, assessments. Are there any districts or school systems currently that are using that as in a formalized way with growth metrics?
So the PACE consortium in New Hampshire, which, thank you, which has a waiver from, they got their waiver back under NCLB, is pursuing a performance assessment approach to measuring student learning, what students know and can do, and you can produce growth scores from performance assessments. The New York Performance Consortium, I may be forgetting a word in their title, has been doing this for a couple decades. So there certainly are cases where this has been done. To date, not statewide, but of course, DC is roughly the size, I believe, of the consortium of districts that are working together in New York and the consortium that's working together in New Hampshire. And then I would add that we're also exploring this and building this out in Massachusetts.
Just to add to that, the Learning Policy Institute, we've put together a brief on performance assessments and the role that they can play in enhancing student learning. And one of the examples we point to is Oakland Unified School District, of having students give presentations and other students even sit in on the panel of trying to metric and decide what grade goes into that. So that's another resource that I'd be happy to share with you.
And I do acknowledge, even with our current PARC assessment, there is a subjective nature to it with components that are analyzed by human beings, right? Like, for instance, writing. So it's not to say that that is, there's no value there, but I did want to genuinely understand where it was being used. And so, yeah, that was mainly the question, the only question I had. So I would yield back my time.
Thank you. Representative Jacobson.
Thank you. Mr. Kostyo, had a quick question for you. You had raised, and you addressed this in one of the questions, metrics beyond assessments that tell about the quality of a school, including attendance and bettering student attendance. DC also has re-enrollment rates, graduation rates, including extended year graduation rates, chronic absenteeism, English language proficiency. Given that we're really trying to work out of the box, and the superintendent was very willing to work with this board on making sure that we're not just working on the assessment, first of all, what are we missing in those other box? And secondly, given all of those metrics that we are using, how important is the high school growth, given that that would mean additional assessment likely?
Yeah, I would say earlier or last year we came out with a report that looked at 5 different measures that advance equity in ESSA state plans, and we looked at chronic absenteeism, school climate, extended year graduation rates, college and career readiness, and suspension rates. And those were measures that you can measure both status and growth in, and those can provide a broader picture of what's happening at a school or across schools at the state level. And in terms of your question as to, what questions you can answer based on that data versus test scores alone. I think being able to see what resources your state has maybe to improve attendance, that might be a different answer than what resources that you're going to put into a school to advance test scores. So I think you can have a broader conversation by looking at growth in all the different indicators that you mentioned that DC is using.
Great. And in my last 45 seconds, can you talk about school climate survey? That's something that the superintendent has agreed to work with us on as well.
Yeah. I think that there are a lot of different surveys out there. We know it can provide a more holistic picture of what's happening at a school. As it was already mentioned, parents are interested in how safe a school is. And so I think it's really important to have conversations with community stakeholders of what information they're interested in and investing up front in having a data collection system that teachers understand and that the community can provide input to. So it can be a really important measure in advancing educational equity, but it really has to create buy-in from teachers and members of the community to use it well.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Batchelor.
Thank you. Just one quick question. I don't know how intricately familiar everyone is at the table with our current framework, but at our elementary and middle school levels, growth is 40% of the framework of a total 70 lumped in with achievement for our assessment. And obviously, if we get a growth metric included at the high school level, there will have to be some tweaking in our framework to get that done. My first question would be your general opinions of growth over proficiency and how we should be weighting those generally, but also at the high school level, what are your opinions about how the growth metric should be weighted at the high school level?
We don't take an opinion on specific accountability decisions, so I think that's just a good thing to work with stakeholders and figure out what your questions are.
Yeah, we're kind of in a similar state. We've started to look at the data from other states and have come up with the considerations that I've shared that it should be a part of the conversation, but to what extent is still something we're looking into.
I can just offer a little bit of benchmarking that at the K-8 level, it tends to be almost evenly split between growth and achievement or status. And in the high school level, it tends to favor status over growth by 2 to 3 times the weighting. But of course, that's skewed by the fact that many states have either not included growth measures at all, whether because they haven't figured out how to do it or because they just haven't mustered the political will to do it, and that is continuing to change pretty rapidly.
Is there a particular reason at that level why there's a switch?
You know, I could speculate about that, but speculating on the record is maybe not the option I'm going to go with right now.
Almost got you.
President Wattenberg.
Thanks. In the earlier panel, I think you heard Ms. Carmichael talked about how in DC Public Schools, which is one of our LEAs, the biggest, but not the only one, but in DC Public Schools, we have cornerstones, which are units that are essentially taught everywhere, and they go from grade to grade. And at least in math, there's and I would say in some other subjects, there is a curriculum and there are unit assessments and end-of-year assessments. Understanding that to some extent they are, as Mr. Parker said, formative, not summative. Well, I think some of them are meant to be summative at the end, but still the teachers are working with them, right? They're not private. Do you know of any places that have figured out how to use the existing curriculum in that way? In other words, to take the existing curriculum that has a pre-test and a post-test and sort of use that in a way that would provide a serious indication and fair and reliable indication of whether the curriculum had been learned well?
That's essentially what performance assessment systems are trying to do. So the idea is that you would be taking the actual curriculum and using assessments that are embedded in the actual curriculum for the purpose of making determinations about student growth and proficiency.
And are there particular districts or states that are doing that? Is that part of the core districts in California?
So the PACE Consortium in New
Okay.
Hampshire, the New York Performance Standards Consortium, again, I may be butchering their name, and then our MCIEA districts. We are not only measuring school quality more comprehensively and rethinking how data are visualized for people, but we are also building out a performance assessment system.
So, okay, I had missed it. So each of those is actually developing or has developed a set of assessments based on the curriculum, and that's how they do a pre-test and a post-test? Or
There are, I don't want to monopolize the time here, but there are common tasks that end up getting used across the consortium, and then there are teacher-developed tasks that are in line with standards that end up getting sort of vetted and approved and enter into a task bank. So more or less, yes.
do others want to say anything on this?
I'm happy to follow up with examples, but our research hasn't really looked at those at this time.
Okay. My one question in my 14 seconds is, I've always thought that my concern with performance assessment is that they're deep but narrow, and that part of what you get from a regular assessment is some sense of the breadth. So that's something I would be interested in as you follow up or have anything, any of you have further comments on that.
Representative's time has expired.
That was great. It says here that was very interesting, but I thought it was great. So thank you to everybody for your great testimony and your great questions. We are ready for, we appreciate you being here tonight, and we will be following up, I have no doubt, with additional questions as we continue our work. Thank you very much, and especially Dr. Schneider, I know you came in from out of town, and to the others, thank you because you came in through the traffic, so both notable.
Thank you.
All right, if our next panel could make their way to the tables, I will call their names. And let me just say, as I indicated at the beginning, this panel has general expertise on assessment, but they also are familiar with our local situation. The second panel is Josh Boots, Executive Director of Empower K-12, Cara Jackson, Associate Partner, Bellwether Education Partners, and Betsy Wolf, Assistant Professor, Center for Research and Reform in Education at Johns Hopkins. Josh Boots is the founder and Executive Director of Empower K-12, a nonprofit organization that specializes in data analytics and the improvement of organizational data capacity. Prior to founding Empower K-12, Josh was the data director at KIPP DC and a member of OSSE's assessment and accountability team. Josh is also a member of the State Board's ESSA task force. Cara Jackson is an associate partner with Bellwether Education Partners. She provides technical assistance to organizations related to program evaluation and quasi-experimental research designs. She has worked for the Montgomery County Public Schools and is the former Assistant Director of Research and Evaluation for Urban Teachers. She holds a PhD in Education Policy from the University of Maryland. And Betsy Wolf is an Assistant Professor at Johns Hopkins University Center for Research and Reform in Education. Some of her current analyses include program evaluations of professional development programs for teachers of English language learners. Formerly, she was a researcher at SRI and a teacher in private, public, and charter schools in DC. She is also a DCPS parent. And I will say about both Betsy and Josh, sorry, Cara, they are very active on Twitter, and you can find out a lot about our schools by following them on Twitter. I will start on my right with Mr. Boots.
Good evening. Thank you, State Board members, for the opportunity to discuss the challenges and possibilities of utilizing growth in the high school STAR framework. I want to take my opportunity to provide just a brief overview of the current landscape of high school growth in the District of Columbia and offer a couple of additional thoughts on the importance of focusing on growth for many of our high schools. Currently, there are two primary methods of capturing math and reading growth in use by high schools across the city, and a third that has been discussed and broadly rejected by schools already. The first one, the Public Charter School Board utilizes the Park Consortium growth percentiles from 8th grade to high school English 2 and geometry as an optional measure for points on their high school performance management framework. Second, several schools administer the nationally normed and Common Core aligned NWA measures of academic progress for students in grades 9 through 11, which provides both fall to fall and spring to spring student growth percentiles. And third, LEA leaders that have high schools in the charter sector have, as part of previous accountability conversations at the state and sector level, discussed and declined to use school level growth estimates available from the College Board suite of high school assessments, including PSAT and SAT, primarily because they're not aligned to the Common Core and the standards that our courses are aligned to. Allow me to expand on these three. First, as the board is probably already aware, the Park Consortium calculates student growth percentiles for every test progression for which there are at least 1,000 students in that same progression across the consortium. In high school, the most common DC math test progression is 8th grade math to geometry 2 years later, but there are other progressions, as Ruth has noted, 8th grade algebra 1 to geometry 1 year later, and 8th grade math to integrated math 2. Most, but not all, of these progressions have student growth percentiles. Relying exclusively on student growth percentile data from Park will leave some of our high schools offering integrated math out. Another Park high school growth business rule challenge is how to address students who spend their freshman year at one school and sophomore year at another. Currently, those students' growth scores count in full for the second school, even though they only attended it for 1 year. Due to these methodological challenges, PCSB includes high school Park as part of their scorecards, but allows the schools the option to include the growth for points. When included, the growth is a 2-year weighted average of the school's median growth percentiles, and last year, 9 of the 19 public high school, charter high schools opted in. Second, a few of our public charter high schools administer the NWA map to students as part of their charter goals. From our experience supporting schools in the analysis of their NWA map data, many at-risk students enter 9th grade more than 2 grade levels below their national peers. For those students, we question the construct validity of growth from their 8th grade Park scores to the required high school assessment. These students require additional instructional interventions, and the effectiveness of those interventions is likely better measured by a computer adaptive assessment than a criterion referenced assessment like Park. And third, DC high school leaders have previously debated PSAT to SAT growth, and that's primarily been broadly rejected because of its non-alignment to the Common Core, and that research has shown limited correlation between SAT scores and college success. Empower K-12 and most of our public school partners believe the challenges of incorporating high school growth and math reading should not outweigh the need for schools serving higher percentages of at-risk students to demonstrate effectiveness across measures that are more suitable for the populations they serve. A STAR framework that allows high schools serving high percentages of students below grade level should be able to demonstrate growth, including through the attendance growth and English language learner growth metrics that are already on the STAR framework, and that they believe it's imperative to ensuring our city's complex system of high schools is adequately assessed for the quality of services expected. And to get there, I see the value in exploring multiple growth models that are in use by other states, like value added, adjusted growth percentiles, median growth percentiles, utilizing data for validity and reliability purposes, using a multi-pronged approach, both normative and criterion reference that includes the DC growth to proficiency metric, which is unique amongst all growth to proficiency metrics in the country and is one of the least correlated metrics with student demographics on our STAR framework already. Any growth measure used should meet psychometric standards for inclusion, and that those tools should meet the high bar for validity and reliability. Otherwise, we risk the validity of the entire system. OSSE should, and I believe already is, exploring the possibility of adding assessments in the 9th grade year, which is a research-based make-or-break year for many of our young adults. Identifying schools with effective programs that positively impact student growth for first-time freshmen and replicating them across the district is critical in our quest to close achievement gaps for all of our students. And my time is almost up. I will end there.
Next. Okay, hi, I'm Cara Jackson, and I'm going to start by talking a little bit about just the broad framework of the discussion to just think about what is it that you want students to get out of high school. So I think in that first panel, you really had a little bit of this discussion already, but we might think about different metrics that could show whether students are college ready, whether they're career ready, whether the school climate is positive and safe. So those are all decisions that you as a board and your constituents would kind of weigh in on what it is exactly that you want students to get out of their time in high school. Specifically, there are several different ways to measure growth, and on this slide I'm just talking about two of them. Growth to proficiency demonstrates the need for, it can show you very clearly how far students have to grow to reach some threshold of proficiency, and that is very important to stakeholders. At the same time, as Stephen mentioned in the first panel, the percent proficient can distort perceptions of growth. And you've been having this discussion all along, but it's also not entirely clear what assessment you would use for these purposes. So another possibility for measuring growth is using something like a value-added model, which is more that apples-to-apples comparison because it controls for different demographics. It better isolates the impact of the school. And it's arguably more fair to schools because they're not being penalized for serving less advantaged students. But again, you would have to figure out what assessment you want to use for that measure. Because I follow Betsy on Twitter, I know a little bit about what's been going on with the star ratings and the relationship between the star ratings and student demographics. And so one of the things I want to say to kind of add on to why value added might be preferable to growth to proficiency is just that within an accountability framework, the value-added measure might be more fair to schools than proficiency-based measures. And we know that schools that serve disadvantaged students are dealing with a lot of difficult to observe resource inequities outside of the school. So there's a couple of different examples on this slide, but what the graph is of specifically shows that the difference in family enrichment spending between the least wealthy families and the most wealthy families, and it's about $8,000 a year. We can't tell families to stop spending money on their kids, but it is something that we want to think about, this inequity that occurs outside of schools, and what does that mean for the achievement gap that we see within and across schools. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we see in Maryland, because that's where I'm from. This first graph is the scatter plot of the student growth percentiles and the percent of students that are eligible for free and reduced price meals. And what you see here is that there isn't really any relationship, not much at all. So the student growth percentiles are measuring student growth, and it's not related to student demographics. So it seems like in that sense it would be a pretty good measure of student growth, a good use for accountability purposes, because we're not holding schools accountable for the student demographics. It's actually just capturing the growth in their scores. But we only have that for elementary and middle school students. That is a pie chart that shows the 5 different categories that we use for our high school accountability model, which includes school quality, academic achievement, graduation rates, progress in achieving English language proficiency, and readiness for post-secondary success. And on this slide, it just tells you a little bit more about the metrics that are used under each one of these categories. And I will just point out that under school quality, we look at chronic absenteeism is 15%. Under academic achievement, we use the percent that meet or exceed on the state English language assessment and on the state math assessment, and then a performance index. Those are status measures. They're not growth measures. So just to be clear about that. So we have all these different measures that we use in our high school accountability system, but what we see is that when you look at the overall points, this accountability system for high schools is very strongly related to school poverty. There's a very strong relationship. Higher poverty schools earn fewer points on average. The schools that are rated only 2 stars in our system have, on average, 70% free and reduced lunch. The schools that are rated 5 stars in this system, on average, only have 10% free and reduced lunch. So there's a really strong relationship between socioeconomic status of the schools and how they perform in this particular accountability model. So I just want to end with a few key takeaways. Define what you want students to get out of high school. Think about the measures that reflect what you want schools to do and to focus on. And if the measures are strongly correlated with poverty, consider additional supports for the schools that serve higher proportions of economically disadvantaged students.
Hello, thank you. My name is Betsy Wolf. Thank you for inviting me to be here tonight. Ruth has already listed all my affiliations, so all my disclosures. So tonight I want to take a few minutes to talk about the relationship between growth measures used in DC and student characteristics in school, thinking about moving forward to using growth at the high school level. In particular, I'm going to explore a little bit why DC growth measures may be picking up differences in student demographics as opposed to differences in student learning. So I'll gloss over this slide because we've already talked about the two growth measures that DC uses. We're not currently using growth measures in high school, but in the elementary and middle schools, growth constitutes a fairly substantial portion of the OSCE school stars. So one myth I hear around DC is that growth measures used in DC account for differences in student poverty and special education and other characteristics, and I would say that's a partial truth. So it doesn't actually explicitly account for differences in student demographics, which I will explore a little bit later. So let's back up one step. How are OSCE school ratings overall related to student characteristics? If OSCE ratings were not related to student characteristics, we may expect a graph like this. Note that as the percentage at risk in the school increases, there's no pattern in terms of better or worse school ratings. So this graph is reality. You can see as the percentage of at-risk students in the school increases, the OSCE school ratings systematically decrease. The question is why? Are OSCE school ratings biased against high at-risk schools, or are schools serving predominantly at-risk students just worse? I'm going to argue that it's the former. But note that an increase in at-risk students by 10 percentage points was associated with a decrease in the OSCE school rating by 6 points. So now let's look at growth. Let's look at median growth percentile in English language arts. You can see that as the percentage of X, the at-risk increases on the X-axis, there's still a decline, but it's not nearly as sharp as for the OSCE ratings. So that means growth is less correlated with at-risk, but it still appears to be correlated. And an increase in at-risk students by 10 percentage points in the school was associated with a decrease in the MGP by 2 points. Now let's look at the same graph with MGP in English language arts, but against special education. And you know there's a pretty sharp decline, meaning that the more special ed kids you have in your school, the lower your growth is. Particularly for schools serving the special ed students with the levels 3 and 4, which are the most serious special ed needs, they have the lowest growth in the city. And the schools serving the most special ed needs are also denoted by the color of the dots. So an increase in special ed students by 10 percentage points in the school was associated with a decrease in MGP by 5 points, which is quite a lot. So why? Is it just because schools serving predominantly at-risk or special ed students are less effective? Let's think about that. So the top graph is what I already showed you, median growth percentile in English language arts against at-risk. And the bottom graph is the growth, but just for the at-risk subgroup only. So you can see that there's a slightly downward slope in the bottom graph, but the slope isn't as steep as the top graph, which tells me that growth metrics appear to at least be somewhat biased for high at-risk schools. The bottom graph also doesn't take into consideration other student characteristics such as special education, which might also explain the slight downward trend. So here's some summaries. This table shows what percentage of variation in school ratings and growth metrics can be explained by student characteristics. The overall OSCE rating, 60% of that can be explained by student characteristics. Another interesting finding that came out of this is actually schools with a lot of English learners, their growth is systematically higher, which makes me think that there might be some kind of testing phenomenon going on there that's giving an advantage to schools serving more ELs. In terms of the growth metrics used in DC, their relationship with student characteristics ranged from 6%, which is not very much, to 36%, which is quite a lot. And the growth characteristics, the student characteristics were more correlated with growth in English than in math, and whether the growth was more correlated with student characteristics in middle or elementary school was a somewhat mixed bag. So my recommendations are to use growth measures that account for differences in student characteristics. Otherwise, we are literally penalizing schools for serving at-risk and special ed kids. Explore growth options for high school, because without growth, right now I think that student characteristics explain somewhere around 80% of the variation in OSCE school ratings in high school. And then maybe explore other ways like formative assessments such as iReady at the elementary school to try to figure out how we could give schools credit for teaching kids and kids learning. So I'll just conclude by a quote. This is a quote from Kareem. He is a teacher at Eastern High School here in DC. And he said, when we use negative labels to describe schools and districts, we often forget about their students. Whether we like it or not, the students have to carry those labels with them. Healthy critiques are necessary, but we have to be honest about the consequences. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions will begin in order. Dr. Gasoy.
Thank you all. So I guess I'll just start with the last thing that was said, which one of your recommendations, Ms. Wolf, was use growth measures that account for differences in student characteristics. And I know one of the concerns around that is that actually the reason why we do this is to show the schools that are not, supposedly not serving students who are most vulnerable. So and actually this is for all three of you. I mean, can you just speak to that, why you think that is not important or why that could be detrimental or, yeah.
Sure, I'll answer that. So the way the median growth percentile is calculated, it actually compares growth for students who started at the same score. But who are we comparing against whom, right? Like we could be comparing at-risk students in some schools with non-at-risk students in other schools and all kinds of variation. And does that make sense? And we're also still kind of controlling for demographics. That's why I said it's partially controlled and not. So we're still already doing that, to be clear, a little bit. But I think it makes more sense to think about what conceptually makes sense. It conceptually makes sense to me that if I'm looking at an at-risk student in a predominantly at-risk school, I might want to not compare that student to a non-at-risk school in Ward 3. I'll stop there.
I think what I would say is that I care about whether what the school is doing is effective. And a school could be making a lot of growth and not quite making it to proficiency, and I don't want to label that school as ineffective, and I don't want to tell that school to stop doing what they're doing because they didn't quite make it to proficiency. So that's what I mean about being the proficiency distorting the measure a little bit.
And I mean, Betsy's data, and we've done this data in Power K-12, is correct that there is some, there is some percentage of growth that is tied to at-risk status. But if we look at, NWA MAP has done this data with nationally normed data, looking at from fall to spring, what is the difference between schools. And as the free and reduced price lunch goes up 10%, the difference in MGP goes down 0.6, so not the full whatever it is here in DC. And why is that? And that's primarily because of differentiated summer learning loss. If you look at, and we've done the study, and we can go into it more, but when you look at, we have schools that do fall to spring and spring to spring growth, and the difference is in those two numbers. They shouldn't be that much different. But those differences in those two numbers are differentiated by the percent of at-risk students that they serve.
Thank you.
Dr. O'Leary.
I have a question for each of you. I'm going to ask the question, then you can answer it, and I did it in order, believe it or not. You talked about the DC growth to proficiency metric. I'd like you to talk about that a little bit, please. The next question has to do with the takeaways that you gave us. How do we get more money to the schools that need the money the most? As far as all of the figures and those graphs and things that I have no idea what they're about. And the third question has to do with the specific population in a lot of different schools in our different wards has to do with ELA students and special ed students. And how are those schools, they're evaluated the same as schools that don't have a high ELA or a high special ed population. How can we change that so the schools are evaluated fairly in the system? Those are my questions.
Before I answer, I will just let the people here in the audience know that the Caps scored. We're up 1-0. Go Caps, CAPP, CAPS, Caps. Growth to proficiency, our metric is, there's growth to proficiency metrics across the U.S. and generally it's looking at how far does a student need to go to be on a trajectory being towards proficient. And in most places, those who are proficient and stay proficient count positively. So that's when like most of the growth to proficiency metrics are highly correlated with that risk, except ours is a little bit different. We have growth targets for every student no matter where they start. For those who are furthest behind, they have higher growth targets because we want them to grow to proficiency within 5 years. But we still have targets and expectations of growth. Well, for level 5 students, the growth target is actually just to have the same score. So our growth to proficiency metric is different than every other state's growth to proficiency metric that I've seen.
Yes, ma'am.
So just kind of building on that, I think one of the things that brings to my mind is that if you know what the different growth to proficient targets are for different schools, then you would be able to see which schools might need the most resources, right? Because there are some schools that are going to have a lot farther to get their students and other schools that will not have quite as far to go.
Thank you.
And to answer your question, I'm on the value add train, which I know scares everyone, but it's not teacher value added. It's totally different. And there's not one model. So what that does, it says, okay, I'm going to take kids of similar characteristics and I'm going to compare their growth in the district. And so I can see which schools are, have kind of higher than average growth for the kids they have, and that doesn't penalize schools. There's so many models that are already being used, and you can pick. You can decide which variables you want to control for and which variables you don't want to control for. There's a lot of different iterations.
Thank you. The representative's time has expired. Ms. McClay?
I have 2 questions, one for Mr. Boots and then one for both you and Cara and Betsy. Mr. Boots, in your testimony, you talked a little bit about the 9th grade assessment and the potential for that. Could you elaborate, while we have a few minutes, on that, and also what you would say to parents who think we already over-test? To Cara and Betsy, both of you talked about value add. You just talked about value add a moment ago to answer Dr. O'Leary's question. In your going into the second year of our report card and looking at growth, in your ideal setting, how would you implement value add, and what would the best way to do that? How would that be? Mr. Boots.
So for 9th grade testing, that would mean testing English 1 and English 2, English 1 in 9th grade, English 2 in 10th grade, and for math, that would probably, for the most students, that's Algebra 1 in 9th grade and Geometry in 10th grade. And then you could look at the growth from 8th grade to Algebra 1 and then Algebra 1 to Geometry, and using value-added models and growth to proficiency models. For parents who say that we're over-testing, 9th grade is such a critical year. It's such a critical year that we need to be assessing our students in that year and finding which schools, like data drives information and information drives change. And so we need, for those parents who are critical of extra testing, we need that information because we need to be able to find which schools are really driving outcomes for our 9th grade students and putting them on the college and career ready trajectory.
Thank you.
I'll answer that. So I think it's actually a pretty easy fix. I think it's pretty low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of places that are already doing value-added models that have already been proven to be effective. You could even look to see if there's any, with PARC, to even cross-check that box. But what I would do is just swap out the growth metrics that we have with a better model, and it wouldn't change like the number of points given to growth or anything like that. I would literally swap them out to try to get a growth metric in that was less biased against high at risk and high sped schools.
And I think the only complication here is that in high school, the students are in different subjects, right? And so I think the question that I would have is it appropriate to use Algebra 1 to predict how much students are going to grow in geometry? Are those subjects similar enough, or is the skill set similar enough that we would be able to model accurately how well we would think students would do in geometry based on how they did in algebra?
New Mexico, Park State, does use a value-added model in high school.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Williams.
Mr. Boots, could you, with all your research and all the focus on your at-risk populations and strong park growth stuff, what what you're calling bold performance and bold performance schools, what does that mean for students and families?
Sorry, can you clarify?
Say it again? Okay. In your work, you have focused on schools with high at-risk populations and strong park growth, okay? Can you speak more about your analysis and what you're calling bold performance and bold performance schools and what that means for students and families looking for schools?
Yes, so we do annually bold performance and bold improvement schools. These are schools with high percentage of at-risk students, and we essentially use a value-added model to look at, is their achievement rates exceeding expectations? And those expectations are like, how are they doing compared to schools that have similar percentages of at-risk served? And so schools that have a statistically significantly higher, like they're 10 to 15 percentage points in terms of their proficiency rates, higher than schools serving similar, with similar demographics, we want to know what they're doing. And a lot of them we find have high growth, but not all of them actually also have high growth data. And the reason why that is because they're elementary schools where they have done really well in kindergarten and first and second grade and have really great third grade outcomes with those students. And so that's why they get lost sort of in the shuffle of achievement and growth, and we honor them with our bold performance.
Thank you.
Dr. Sutter by proxy? Okay. Mr. Batchelor.
Thank you. Dr. Jackson, I had a clarifying question in your presentation around Maryland's accountability in the section around readiness for post-secondary success. There's a 5% weight for on track for 9th grade. I'm a little confused by that. Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, I have it written down here. So the on track for second grade, I believe, is the students.
I'm sorry, on track for 9th at the high school.
Earning at least 4 credits in a specific list of courses. And then the completion, the percent of students graduating or exiting with a certificate program completion that have achieved at least one of the specific requirements. So they have like a list of classes. And for on track in 9th grade, it's pretty much like your core academic classes.
So assessed on whether your 9th grade cohort has taken all the requirements.
Taken and earned the credits for those courses, yeah.
Got you. And my second question is about coordinated support. So obviously the main goal of our assessment system is to coordinate supports, interventions, enhancements to programming to make those schools better and help students grow. I think given the conversation around this year's budget, our families believe that those supports are insufficient and less than coordinated. In your opinion, I guess all of you, how could our system statewide, but also in our LEAs, better coordinate supports so that families feel confident that they can stick with those schools and that they'll see growth over time, and that our families have confidence to want to go and support and have faith in those school buildings?
I mean, I'll start by saying our mayor and our council need to fund our schools at the adequacy funding rate. It's been 5 years. We are still 8% short. So let's start by giving our schools the adequate funding base per pupil rate. Start there. But also Empower K-12, and I know other organizations are working with schools to like gather intervention data, like academic intervention data, and to finally use data across schools to find what academic interventions are making a difference, and then talking about them and replicating them as best as we can, doing continuous improvement, short-term continuous improvement.
I'll add to that. I mean, I think that would be great in DC, Josh, but we also do know a lot from research just about kind of what works. The problem is that schools, the at-risk funds have been supplanting, not supplemental. So schools don't actually have a slush fund where they can take money and buy an extra intervention to intervene. But I'll say, so I think we need more money to actually to go to the schools that have low proficiency and or low growth, and those are two separate things. But I'll also say that for our schools, we also need a well-rounded curriculum. You know, in addition to the reading specialists, like we need to offer like a decent number of AP classes of rigor at all our schools, period, the end. And so we're not doing either of those things. Like, we're not offering a relevant curriculum to begin with, and we're not supplementing where it needs to be supplemented.
The representative's time's expired. Caps are up 2-0. Mr. Jacobson.
Thank you, Mr. Executive Director, and for allowing me to speak and for that terrific news. Mr. Boots, you had said in your testimony that PCSB uses growth as an optional measure for schools. Are optional measures permissible under ESSA?
No, they are not.
Okay, thank you. You also mentioned computer adaptive assessments, and I believe that's the Smarter Balance Assessment, is that correct?
No, it's the NWA MAP, Measures of Academic Progress.
The last time that someone that I recall was here to talk about computer adaptive assessments, they weren't serving students that were severely below proficiency. Has that changed?
Yeah, so the way that Measures of Academic Progress works in computer adaptive nature is that it has items for high school that go as low as 6th and 5th grade if necessary. So as a student is not getting the 8th grade questions right, it gives it 7th grade questions. If they're not getting 7th grade questions, it gives them 6th grade questions. So you know exactly where that student is.
That is incredibly helpful. Thank you very much. It's been a while since we've been updated on that, so that's very helpful. You also mentioned, I'm just going to stick on you and then I'll move to Drs. Jackson and Wolf in my next round. You also mentioned adding a 9th grade assessment. Given the tension between overtesting and assessments and understanding how important growth is at the high school level, how do we bridge that tension in a way that's productive and really serves our students best?
Well, I think, and I know that there were educators from Empower Ed that were here too. I think it could really be, there's got to be multiple pronged, right? Our educators have to believe in the importance of growth, and if our educators can talk to their parents, like, it's got to be a multi-pronged approach. It can't just be the mayor saying that we're going to do this or the superintendent saying that we're going to do this. I think a multi-pronged approach to convince our parents that, like, this is important information and important data, not only to say how our schools are doing, but also to get better as a city serving 9th grade, because we lose a lot of kids in 9th grade. We have an insane amount of dropouts after 9th grade.
So would adding an additional assessment at 9th grade be helpful in the dropout rate?
It would help us find effective practices in which schools are effectively serving 9th grade.
Right, and I think your comment about stopping the discussion about over-testing and really talking about more coming at this from a vision of assessments help us calibrate and serve our students better is super important, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Parker.
Thank you. I will start with Betsy, if that's okay. I'm really intrigued by your notion of using value add measures in place of the growth metrics that we currently have. I'm asking you to connect the dots for me. So just to make sure I'm clear, you're saying we would compare apples to apples, or essentially at-risk students to other at-risk students across the city to see which schools or bright spots exist, and use that almost as a bell curve of sorts to track growth across the city. Is that the idea? And I guess the follow-up question to that would then be, what impact would that then have on the ratio of growth to absolute proficiency that is already set up? Because in my mind, how do we know that we're doing right by our at-risk students? And so if we set the bar to who's ever doing that the best, that doesn't necessarily say that that's meeting the absolute the standards that we've set. And so if you could just talk about the impact that would have on ratio. And then Mr. Boots, if you could just talk about the fall to spring assessment and using that. I was really intrigued by moving from spring to spring to fall to spring, and what reliability does that have on an adaptive assessment, kind of following up in Representative Jacobson's comments, and if there are any data points that you can provide there.
Let me start by saying, you're right about the value-added model. You can control for things or not control for things and compare apples to apples. So the beautiful thing is that these data exist somewhere. You could actually look at that. You could look at how do at-risk kids grow across the district at various schools. You could look at how non-at-risk kids grew across the district at various schools, and you can make a decision. Like, are there schools doing good work here? So I'm okay with this normative distribution, or maybe you want to adjust you take the value-added model and then you tweak the score for the OSCE rating if you're not quite happy enough with the at-risk growth. But we can answer all of these questions if we had access to the data.
And as an additional follow-up, in our STAR framework, we actually already, to some extent, do control and have the ability to look at how our at-risk students doing against other at-risk students, and actually counts for 5 points. That at-risk subgroup has floors and targets that are based off of how our at-risk students doing, that are different than the all students floors and targets. And then second, separately, fall to spring and spring to spring, in terms of validity and reliability, and on NWA MAP specifically, meets the psychometric standards for inclusion. Many states actually use it in grades 3 through 8 as part of their state accountability system. We should be careful in terms of looking at fall to spring versus spring to spring because of the amount of the summer learning loss and gaps that we have, that we need to be cognizant of. Those gaps do contribute to a gap that's larger and wider. In fact, there's a research study that says that 60% of the gap by 9th grade is due to summer learning loss alone.
The representative's time has expired. President Wattenberg.
Thank you. My first question is for each of you. So each of you in different ways has made the point, showed graphs that show proficiency levels are highly correlated with demographics, and also in many cases that certain kinds of growth scores are also highly correlated with demographics. So my question, and then so there's different ideas about how to pull that out so you're really measuring the quality of the school and not who's in the school, how many special ed students there are. So my question is, how do you give us confidence that when we do these changes that what we're doing is developing an unbiased way to measure quality and not just saying quality is actually less at these schools and now we're going to get rid of that in terms of the visibility, because I don't think we want to do that at all. So how do you distinguish between those two ways of thinking about the data? So in other words, we want the bias out in terms of showing whether there's quality going on in that school, but if there's not quality, we don't want to have controlled it out.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on what Josh said earlier. You could look at subgroups. So if you look at at-risk kids across all the schools, and really the schools kind of get worse, the more at-risk kids there are, you should see that subgroup go down. If you look at, at-risk kids who are special ed level 1, if you look at that subgroup of all schools, you would be able to see what happens, as your percent at risk increases. If you don't see a big drop off there, then that means it's probably not school quality, but it's probably the student characteristics. So you could parse up the student subgroups in as many ways as you want to and get as fine grade as you want to and look at their trajectory, their performance across all the schools, and it kind of gives some idea about how much is explained by student characteristics versus actual school quality.
Yeah, and I would just say you want to be careful to maybe keep an eye on the indicators of school quality as well, because it is possible that in the process of controlling for these student demographics, we're also picking up a little bit of school quality factors that vary as a function of demographics, right? So if our lowest income students also have the least experienced teachers, we know that on average less experienced teachers tend to be less effective, and so we might be picking up that a little bit. And so I would say it's about looking at all the measures that you have and thinking about school quality in a multifaceted way.
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to be very careful about.
Yeah,
that we capture that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just to second that. The National Research Council's PARA report even showed that just using impact, which is value added, which does control for demographics, shows that we do not have an even distribution of teacher quality across the city. So we don't want to overcorrect and control for things that should be concerning to us. So there are adjusted growth percentile models and value-added models that can do that without overcorrecting for things that should actually be illuminated and concerning to us.
Thank you. Final round of questions, Dr. Gasoy.
This is for Dr. Jackson. I was just interested, looking at the criteria on the Maryland tool, school quality and student success, and readiness for post-secondary success. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what those measures are.
Sure. So school quality and student success includes chronic absenteeism, access to a well-rounded curriculum, and school climate. I didn't mention this earlier, but chronic absenteeism is also very strongly related to school poverty. So that's just something to be cautious about if you're including that in an accountability model. And then the readiness for post-secondary success is that on track for 9th grade indicator. So that's about what courses they take and complete in 9th grade. And to your point, like 9th grade is definitely a sort of gateway year. It's really important. And so keeping kids on track in that year, it's arguably something that would be very important for you to consider. And then completion of a well-rounded curriculum. So the access to the well-rounded curriculum is whether or not they have those course offerings and they're taking them, and then the completion part is whether or not they successfully completed them. And it could be a career and technical education program.
So that's really interesting, actually, because part of the ESSA is about incentivizing schools to have a well-rounded curriculum, but I think there's a tension there with the emphasis on testing if that's the route that you choose as a state. So I guess I'm just interested to know how that is it standard across the state in terms of how you're measuring what a well-rounded curriculum looks like, and how does it look at different levels then, like high school versus elementary schools?
Yes, so my understanding is there's a state definition, and it is really interesting because in the middle schools, at least, if you give students a little bit more leeway to choose their courses, then your school might actually take a hit because, my son, for example, did not sign up for art next year. And so it looks like he doesn't have access to a well-rounded curriculum because that was a choice he made to take a technology class instead.
Okay, so it's based on what the kids take and not just what the school offers.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And I know that OSSI is already engaging on this work, that they are looking at, is it available, is it being accessed, and is it being equitably accessed across all student groups?
Dr. O'Leary?
I'd like to get your opinions on what we can do to make the star rating more equitable.
Well, I'll channel Dr. Schneider and say, why do we need one rating? We could have a lot of indicators about schools. We could have the curriculum. We could have growth, student surveys. It's kind of a new thing in education research where they're actually correlated with teacher value added. So there's a lot of reliability there. School climate. I think the problem is because ESSA requires, if you're going to have a rating, ESSA requires some high proportion that to be based on proficiency. But I think we have to be honest about what we're actually measuring. We're measuring proficiency. Are we measuring school quality, like what the school is doing to help kids learn? Or are we measuring the parental education and income? Because if it's the latter, we don't want to be telling schools whether they're doing a good job or a bad job based on factors that are completely unrelated to what happens at the school.
Related to Jack, just he mentioned the core districts and the dashboard system that they use. Note that USC did a study of parents' preferences about having a summative rating versus a dashboard, and the parents supported a summative rating 55 to 40, and then they looked at who are the ones that have actually used the dashboard, and once they looked at only the parents that had only used the dashboard, it moved to 69 to 29 of preference to having a single rating. So we should probably do something similar here in the district too, but just know that parents want a summative rating too. Otherwise, if we're not, then we're leaving it to greatschools.org to do that, and I don't know that we want that to be our system. Things that we can do, Empower K-12 has advocated for looking at growth or proficiency. Like if you serve a high income population and they are proficient and staying proficient, great. That's what we care about, right? If you're serving a low income population that is coming in multiple grade levels behind, let's focus more on growth. So having differentiated weighting across growth and proficiency depending on who you serve might be one. Also, we do already have the at-risk subgroup. It's currently 5 points. If you serve more at-risk students, maybe it should be worth more than 5 points. And then it's literally, how are you doing with the population you serve?
And I would just add that think about which indicators are most strongly related to demographics and what can be done to address that. So in the example of chronic absenteeism, there's been a lot of research in recent years about these relatively low-cost interventions that we can do to try and address chronic absenteeism. And if you know that that is something that a school is struggling with, that's an opportunity to say, let's try this out here so that we can help increase your rating so that it doesn't show as much inequity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. DC United scored in the 27th minute. Ms. McClay.
DC United? Mm-hmm. All right.
There's multiple games going on.
Rooney.
No, we're multiple. All right. Thank you for being here tonight. As a follow-up to my earlier question, I know Mr. Parker had some questions around it too, and I think you answered them a little bit in the value add space. However, I'm a little confused or perhaps this was a little too simplistic. And Ms. Wolf, you talked about value add being swapped as a one-to-one. Can you go into detail or elaborate a little bit more about switching into value add as a one-to-one?
Sure, so I can zip back, but basically the two growth measures we use, the median growth percentile and the growth to proficiency, we could just basically use a different measure for those, the value add measure, and then whatever the outcome for the value add measurement is, we would assign points based on that instead of the median, the growth percentile and growth to proficiency, and award points based on that. Does that answer your question?
I think so, yes. Okay. Secondly, this is strictly an opinion question for each of you. When we were looking at a high school diploma, all right, and what a high school diploma means, that definition, and Cara, you even put in your slideshow, we want to make sure, when you're looking at this, what do you want students to get out of school, okay? And at the end of the day, we want students to be college and career ready when they leave school, no matter what. From a growth perspective, looking at school quality, what measurements would you look at the end of the day to make sure students, what we're measuring makes students college and career ready?
I think in some ways that question is better asked of the students themselves to see what goals they have for themselves. But the first slide that I showed had, a number of different measures. For college readiness, you might look at things like AP offering, the AP course taking. Are they succeeding in those classes? What scores are they getting on the AP exams? In their college-going culture, are they being counseled about filling out their FAFSA forms? That kind of thing. And then in the career ready, it's CTE program offering successful placement, successful internships, getting a lot of information from the students about how they are feeling about those experiences, setting them up for the next stage of their life.
Anyone else?
I'll say as a parent, I think what would constitute a good high school experience is, some level of academics for sure, but then also some engagement in other areas, some success or interest or engagement in clubs or activities or whatever it may be.
And just another additional creative way you could think about it is look at students who come to your high school that scored maybe level 1 or level 2 in 8th grade, and how many of them stayed with you all 4 years and graduated on time, right? That's like a sense of growth, and then how well did they do on the SAT? You could look at over time the students that were with you multiple years, how well did they do?
And I remember what I was going to say.
Ms. Williams?
No further questions.
Mr. Batchelor.
No further, but I will give additional time to answer that last question. And then also, if Dr. Jackson, if you had an answer to my last question about how do we better coordinate supports for struggling schools to make sure that they're providing the growth that students need?
I think that's a great question, and you're in an environment where there's a lot of different nonprofits and community partners who really want to be part of this. So I think tapping into the resources that you have in this community is really important. I think that using the data from your star ratings and from the different indicators, all this information you're collecting, to sort of think about what are the package of interventions or support that would best address each school's needs is one way to go about that, and to start to sort of target your resources accordingly.
I was just going to say, the other thing that I think is important is soft skills, like learning how to do school, like learning how to be responsible, go to class, do homework, because when you go to college, I mean, that's a big difference. You know, you're going to school on your own, you're the only person responsible, you're doing your laundry. So learning those skills in high school, I think, is also really important.
Thank you.
And this is an open, free time. Just in addition to what I had already mentioned about the dashboard and how parents want a single rating, I don't think it should be one or the other. It should be an and both. We actually, the Empower K-12, we have our STAR dashboards on our website that we utilize the publicly available data from OSSE. And I looked it up before I came here that we've had 1,045 unique visitors to visit our STAR dashboards. 32% of them were referred to our dashboards from a parent blog, like an DC Urban Mom or another parent blog site, and another 37% came from Google searches related to DC school report cards. So I think it shouldn't be one or the other, it should be an and both.
Mr. Parker.
I just want to note, and not to say that this is happening with you all's testimony, that I feel we use the term at risk as a proxy to talk about real issues around, like, black students in this city and nationally are not performing well, in my perspective, due to the system failing them. So I just want to call that out, that I hear a lot about at risk. I do want you all to take a second to, based on the various proposals you discussed, like, what are some of the considerations we should keep in mind? I appreciate it, like some of the concerns around, like, oh, this might pick up, I forget the exact example you gave, but this might pick up truancy or whatever the fact may be. Like, so what are some of the considerations we should make? And in particular, if going back to this value-added model that you spoke about, Betsy, if we were to do that, I imagine some schools that are, let's imagine we keep the STAR rating system as we have now, just for the sake of this example. I get that we don't need it. I imagine some one-star schools might move up. They might move to a 2-star or 3-star school because they are now getting more points for growth. Would the opposite, is there a possibility for the opposite being true, that a 4 or 5-star school can move down? And then what impact might that have racially, that we know our black students are underserved in the city, but then the data might then tell us, oh, we actually need to go to Northwest because X school where affluent students are going, they're not growing sufficiently enough. So how do we account for that, and what might be considerations, if that makes sense?
I have two responses to that. Those are great questions. One about so the charter school high school growth data is out there, and we did an analysis to look at how well is that correlated to every other metric already on the STAR system, and it was statistically significantly correlated with every other outcome on the high school framework, including attendance, including re-enrollment, except for APIB, and this was the only one. So, like, having better attendance, having lower chronic absentee rate was all correlated with having higher growth. And so I'm not sure that, like, while it is possible that, like, a 5-star school could go down with growth, like, better outcomes on all these other metrics have signified better outcomes on growth. And then related to your concern about race versus socioeconomics, I think that that's something that OSSE could work on and publish, so we could be like, how are our black at-risk students doing versus our Hispanic at-risk students versus our white at-risk students, if we have a few. So, like, I think that that's a possibility, and it could help us drive that conversation.
I hear what you're saying. I will say I always defaulted to at risk because in my analysis it's much more explanatory in DC than black because you do have a lot of affluent blacks. And when I did this analysis, I put in black and white and it wasn't important, it wasn't significant. So at risk does explain a lot. To your second question, I think it's kind of.
But if I could just quickly interject, we also know that that pool of at risk is very narrow in the sense that there are a lot of other students outside of that definition that are being underserved. So
Representative's time has expired.
Point of order, can I yield the
You
30 seconds of the time I
You
yielded
already
back?
yielded back your time. You don't have additional time.
Oh.
If Mr. Jacobson or Mrs. Wattenberg would like to, that would be fine, but Mr. Jacobson.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jackson, what's the value of the STAR framework having unique targets and weighted scores vis-a-vis their peers, like those subgroups that we've talked about?
Say that one more time.
What's the value in the DC STAR framework of disaggregating by subgroup and weighting those subgroups separately?
So I think it maybe helps get at what you're talking about in terms of figuring out, like, are schools serving different groups of students differently? And I know the conversation that's happening in Montgomery County right now is about, you can look at the school average outcomes, and that can mask a lot that's going on beneath the surface. And so there may be schools that on average are looking really strong, and then when you go and you look at the certain subgroups, it's not serving those students well. And so I think it's similar to, NCLB accountability and the breakdown, the disaggregation of the data, it just to kind of shine a light on that specific problem to make sure that schools are not hiding behind some overall average.
And I would also say we did follow-ups with parents in Ward 7 and 8 who have special needs students who specifically use the STAR framework's special needs subgroup information to figure out where they might want to send their kid related to special needs to the
Great.
next level.
Thank you. Dr. Wolf, you suggested that multiple indicators rather than a single indicator might give us a better view of a school's performance. Am I repeating that correctly?
I'm not sure if I made that point, but I support that idea.
Are multiple indicators ESSA compliant?
I'm not sure the answer to that. I would assume so because we have multiple indicators now.
They are, but as I understand it, ESSA requires a single sort of rating for a school to be able to determine what the bottom 5% of schools are. And that's really critical so that those schools are getting the additional support that they really need. And I think this has been a theme throughout the night. There are a lot of really great ideas and theories and alternatives. We as a board, we as a state education agency are really constrained by the federal government and what's required under ESSA. And I don't want us to lose sight of that. I think it can be a yes and, but to pretend that we can ignore some metrics, some indicators, some requirements is giving folks a false hope or a false indicator of what we can actually achieve. And I want that to be clear, and I want to make sure that we continue to raise that as we talk about ESSA. There are some bedrock requirements that we've got to do, and they might not be sexy, and we might not like doing them because we might not agree with them morally, but we've got to do them because the federal government makes us. Thank you. I yield back.
President Wattenberg.
I watch my time, Madam President.
If I could read my notes, I intended this to be very rapid fire. So first of all, it came up that maybe we could just do 9th grade. Is that a possibility? In other words, I think there is a concern about over-testing, but what if we tested in 9th grade and not 10th grade? And then you had the 8th to 9th grade. Does that make a difference? Does that help? Just start with Betsy.
I mean, ninth grade is better because it's closer to 8th grade, but 8th grade to 10th grade is still better than nothing. It's just that the further away you get, the less it's going to explain, but it'll still explain a lot. I mean, kids' test scores across grades, across subjects, it's all correlated.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I guess I would say, there's always trade-offs that if you are focusing on 9th grade for growth, then I would just think about what metrics you have that address 10th, 11th, and 12th grade so that the overall accountability system captures all the years of high school and not just 9th grade.
Same. If we have to choose, I'd choose 9th grade. but I don't want to have to choose. And then if we had to choose only ninth grade, those metrics of like, those kids in ninth grade and aren't doing well, then like use them as a metric to like, and then 3 years later that you serve them all those 3 years, how did they do on the SAT or the APIB, or did they graduate, those kinds of metrics.
Okay, second, I just wanted to acknowledge, let me ask Josh a question. You did a number of runs of data around our park score, around our ratings and schools in the city to determine which collection of indicators created the least biased rating. What was that?
Yeah, well, there's a whole blog post where there was a lot of different things. Our ESSA compliant recommended model included giving additional weight to the at-risk subgroup for schools that served more at-risk students, and then having an adjusted growth percentile that controlled for summer learning loss, and then having an additional metric that was like giving a best of to growth or proficiency, because when you're further behind, your growth matters, and when your kids are already there, proficiency matters.
And I think that last one also speaks to Mr. Parker's point that it would provide a way of assuring that schools that should be measured by growth got measured by growth, and it wouldn't, but schools that already had high proficiency would be acknowledged as having high proficiency.
And I wouldn't want to give like unreasonable expectations, as it does say that school ratings had to be comparable across schools.
So that wouldn't be ESSA compliant. That
like
idea would not be ESSA compliant.
The feds have approved plans that have like a 5 to 10% differences in like the weights of things, but no more than that.
And also, I think somebody said that New Mexico uses a value added. Is that correct for further?
Yes, for high school growth for park.
Okay, I'm over, so the end. Thank you very, very much for your testimony. Thanks for being here tonight. It was great also. I learned so much. And you are dismissed. And we will be in touch, I have no doubt. Thank you very much for coming out. With no further business before the State Board, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right, thank you, everybody. Good night. And what are the scores? What are the scores?
End of the first 2-0.
2-0, okay.
So what do we leave this and
We've upgraded.
I know, but do we keep this?